kind of what the nonprofit, if you're still involved in it, and kind of mission statement, and if you could put it in the chat, for the connection, if you're willing to share
Oh, my
that.
nonprofit.
Huh?
You're asking about my nonprofit?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's the Vista Expertise Network, and it's concerned with medical software.
Oh,
Um,
okay, okay.
Vista is the name of the medical software developed by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. It's used at all their hospitals. It's used at all the Indian Health Service hospitals. It's even used at the Department of Defense hospitals
Okay.
and many state and private hospitals and hospitals around the world. It's basically the only medical software that was developed by doctors and nurses and pharmacists and lab techs for themselves and their own use. Everything
Okay.
else was written ostensibly for medical people, but written by people who didn't know medicine, who were programmers. And frequently, most of the medical software was developed to focus on billing. Through the 1980s and 90s, many hospitals had no software to help them with patients at all, other than sending bills. That was what they focused on. So they wanted the money. So Vista has an unusual pedigree, and it's open source. It belongs to everybody. It's free. It's,
Mm.
as you might expect, after 40 years, it's complex. So part of what we do with our nonprofit is we upgrade the software to keep pace with medicine, and we also teach people how to use it, and how to develop it and extend it themselves, how to join the community that supports it. So that's what I do. That's my day job.
Okay. I got the impression it was something in education, but
Well, I
I thought
teach a
it
lot.
was with younger, I thought it was with children.
Oh
But
no, yeah.
okay.
Well, I mean, you can teach some of this stuff to children for sure, but that's not our main focus. And in fact, for medical software, it's really helpful if the people you teach to program are midlife or later, that they've already had a career in medicine, because
Yeah.
it turns out it's much easier to teach programming to a medical professional than it is to teach medicine to a programmer. Medicine's complicated, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So a lot of the people that we teach are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s or later.
Okay.
But we can teach. I mean, I was a teenager when I was 17 when I learned. So it can be taught to younger kids.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. That's my day job. And then the rest of the time I do this. So
Okay.
I guess for our recording, welcome everybody to the Kenneth Smith seminar, our Millennia and Microcosm series. We're in year 3 at this point. We've had 100. This is our 126th of these seminars. We did some Kenneth Smith stuff before we started Millennia and Microcosm, but this is what the current arc is. And we're in medieval civilization. We're about 2.5, 3 months into medieval civilization, which places us, in paragraph 8 of the first chapter that's about medieval civilization. And we'll talk about why in a second. So this is chapter 5 of an upcoming book. The book will be called Millennium Microcosm. It was originally published as a column in the back of a magazine called the Comics Journal in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And in the installments, and David and I are pulling it together into a book for Kenneth, um, and it will be published anon, probably after we're done with this seminar. First 2 years we spent on the first of 3 worldviews. This book goes through 3 worldviews: the ancient worldview, the medieval worldview, and the modern worldview. Not because those are the only possible ways of looking at the world, but because they're very well documented. So we have a lot of written information about what people subscribing to each of these worldviews thought about the world and themselves and God and nature and so forth. And the exercise that Kenneth wants to invite us to in this book is to really work to escape the trap of thinking that the worldview we were born into is the only correct way of seeing the world. He wants to teach us how to escape that trap so that we can learn to look at the world a little bit like the way the ancients did in their own terms, and then a little bit like the way the medievals did in their terms. And then finally, to come back around at the end of the book to the modern worldview, to look at it with fresh eyes, to say, what would an ancient think about the modern worldview? What would a medieval think about the modern worldview? And by doing that, we sort of learn how to use worldviews um, competitively, how to harness them to each other, to critique each other, to critique each other's weaknesses. And the hope is that by doing this, we learn to see more about the world and ourselves and the divine than we can see if we stay trapped in any one of these worldviews. So this is where we are. We're in chapter 5. It's the first chapter about medieval civilization and the medieval worldview. It's introducing the medieval perspective, and it's doing it largely by comparisons and contrasts with the ancient worldview. In chapters to follow, 6, 7, 8, he's going to get more into how the medievals saw the world in their own terms. But right now, since we've spent all this time in the earlier chapters looking at the ancient worldview, he's trying to introduce the medieval world through a series of contrasts, showing us what an astonishing revolution the medieval worldview is. It overthrows every major source of value that the ancients had and inverts it. And so in paragraph 8, we're about to get into the next part of
Hey,
that.
Rick, let me ask you, since this is the daytime, how come you're not working on your medical software instead of doing this stuff?
Well,
This is daytime. What
there's
not at night?
there's two answers. One is the advantage of being self-employed, since I'm the executive director of my nonprofit, is I can control my own hours. And as part of that, I typically work starting about 5 in the morning Pacific time. I get up, I roll over, pull over my computer and start working. So by the time we start these seminars, I've had most of a day of work already. So that's how I'm able to do it at this time. That's why I'm able to do it now. Good question, Phil. Thank you. It's
Oh, the trick question. No, it's not a good question at all.
Yeah, no, it's legit. I mean, a lot of people schedule their seminars for nights and weekends.
Mhm.
I don't do that because nights and weekends are when my family and friends are wanting to schedule things. I'm freer I'm able to be more free Mondays during the day than I am at other times. So I know it's an inconvenience for people, but fortunately, David records these things. He live streams them, but he also puts them on YouTube. So the YouTube channel is there. Oh, and I forgot to put the link. Let me drop the link in here to the text online, which again, David has very helpfully scanned the text and got it up online. So you can read along, follow along. You can go back to earlier chapters. You can read his other books, kind of whatever you have a taste for. There are sort of 3 topics I'm thinking about today relating to this paragraph. For those who are just joining us, whether on live stream or YouTube, part of the reason we take so long with this is that Kenneth's approach to philosophy is not to try to get you to believe that he has a system and that you should believe his system of thinking. That's not Kenneth's way. That's more of an escapist approach to philosophy. He's an existentialist, and so he wants to talk about things the way they actually are. And as part of that, he has to deal with the fact that he actually doesn't know everything, and neither do we, and neither does any system. So his approach to philosophy is to try to point us at lots of other resources. You'll see this in chapter 8. He's referring frequently, sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly, to other writers. And he's trying to encourage us basically to give ourselves a philosophy education, not just by reading his text, but by using his text as a jumping off point. As part of that, he uses terminology in a very precise, specific ways. And part of the reason we're taking our time with this is to unpack it. Say, when he says this, is this a reference to some other writer? And if so, who? And if so, why? Why is he referring to, in one case, Aristotle or Tacitus or somebody else? So we're going to go into this. We're going to dive into it. But I sort of got 3 topics for today, which we may or may not get to. One of them, the last topic, which we may or may not come to, is death and the soul. I had to cancel last week because my 18-year-old kitty, Surya, died, who had been my constant companion for many years. And so I needed to take some time to grieve. And so how the ancients saw death and how the medievals saw death, these are things that are interesting for trying to introduce the medieval worldview. But we probably won't get to that this week. We'll probably save it for another week. Another thing that we want to talk about is, thank you, Joe. Another thing we want to talk about in here is, I want to talk about ancient versus medieval versus modern versus, say, scientific approaches to history. What is the purpose of history? How do you explain history? Why do you write books? What are books for? The medieval epoch is very focused on a single book, right? It's very focused on the Bible. It's the centerpiece of the literature of the medieval epoch. And a great mass of material kind of emerges inspired by the Bible, reacting to the Bible, whether it's agreeing with the Bible or extending the Bible or refuting the Bible, it's still Bible centric. This is something that thank you, Geneva. This is something that Harold Bloom talks about in his work about literature. He talks about the anxiety of influence. He says, for example, for English writers, the most important thing to understand is what an influence Shakespeare is. And if you're going to set out to write something and you want it to be something amazing, you have to grapple with the fact that Shakespeare was already here ahead of you, and he already had things to say about a lot of these topics. And many things, not always, but many things he said in magnificent form, to the point that, you're sort of in a competition with this guy who's a genius. The same thing happens in classical music. Harold Bloom doesn't talk about that as much, but Brahms does. Brahms took forever to basically write his first symphony. He was one of the most highly educated musical, composers of the 19th century, and yet he waited longer than almost any of them to get his first symphony out. And the reason he took so long to get his first symphony done, as he said, is you can't imagine what it's like to hear that giant stomping along behind you, he says, referring to Beethoven. He says, if you're going to write a symphony, why bother writing something inferior to Beethoven, right? That's already been done. Beethoven set the bar, and, you should wait until you can clear the bar, says Brahms says. This issue of the anxiety of influence, this is very much at the center of medieval culture. We're going to get into that in the years ahead as we go forward. The Bible itself as a frame of reference, whether it's Psalms or Proverbs, whether it's Matthew, whether it's the epistles of Paul, over and over, anytime someone wants to write something new, they have to express it in relationship to this body of work from the Jews and the Christians and, the Greeks and the Latins and so forth. It's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. It's the elephant in the room. It can't be avoided. So if we're going to talk about a book and why people write books, then we're going to have to grapple with some of the most interesting research into texts that has happened in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, which has to do with why did ancients write books? What did they think they were doing when they sat down to write a book? And what did medievals think they were doing when they sat down to write a book? Because that very much affects how we read this book and therefore how we interpret the entire body of literature that sprang up around it or in reaction to it. If we make the mistake of thinking that the authors of the Bible were writing it for the reasons that we would write a Bible, then we're going to misunderstand all of this. We won't. They were not moderns. They were not thinking about modern things. They weren't trying to make a living, first of all. They weren't trying to be famous, second of all. Not trying to make a living is a big deal. Not trying to be famous is a big deal because many people wrote under somebody else's name, which is an issue that biblical scholars have come to terms with long ago, but a lot of contemporary kind of more naive Bible readers don't understand. Mark didn't write Mark. Matthew didn't write Matthew. Luke didn't write Luke. John didn't write John. These Gospels were written by communities, and they attributed them to the apostle that they saw as their founder. And these Mark doesn't represent the words of Mark. Mark represents what the later Markan community imagines Mark would have said based on their understanding of kind of Mark's philosophy and what he was about. Now, right off the bat, over half of readers of the Bible don't understand that, but it's obvious, and it's true for many of the letters too. This comes into play in the 2nd century and 3rd century when the church retroactively inserts letters into Paul's corpus that Paul never wrote, and we can tell because the grammar's wrong, the vocabulary is wrong. It's like Jesus saying, "Blessed are the groovy, for they shall totally get funky with y'all." It's cool, but that terminology did not exist, in 30 CE. That just wasn't there. And when you see people saying groovy and funky, you're like, I don't think that was Jesus. You can do that with the epistles. You read Timothy, you read some of these later epistles, and you're like, no, Mark. Paul wouldn't have said those things. And I've talked before about how Paul was such a booster of women prophets and visionaries. Right? He's constantly telling the churches, you listen to your holy women. They know all these amazing things. Here, let me tell you about some of the holy women. And then later, a century or so later, among the orthodoxy, there was a counter reaction where they're trying to drive women out of positions of leadership and trying to make a male hierarchy in the church. And so they started going back to all the old letters and gospels and inserting lines to say, see, these guys thought that women should shut up too. And it's done so clumsily that there are places in Paul where he's giving you a list of women prophets, and in the middle of the list he'll say things like, women should shut up and sit down in church, and then it'll go back to praising women and how great they are. It's like, it is patently obvious Paul didn't say that part in the middle. I'm going to give you a list of 4 women. 1, 2, shut up, women, and sit down. 3, 4. That part in the middle does not fit the list that's there. So textual analysis, 18th, 19th, 20th century, is allowing us to get a better look at what is the Bible? What are these works that make up the Bible? Why were they written? Why were they edited the way they are? And what then is the effect that it has upon us as we look back upon our history and see all of this literature being generated by it? So that's one of the things I wanted to talk about. I want to give you a little more on that. If you haven't read Gilbert Murray, Rise of the Greek Epic, you totally should. I'll put the name here. Rise of the Greek Epic. You can Google it. You can find it online for free on the Internet Archive and download yourself a copy if you want. It is one of the books that Kenneth Smith recommends in his lifetime reading list. And it tells you a great deal about the creation of the Iliad and the Odyssey, specifically. But also then generally, it teaches you a lot about how did ancients think about how did they think about what they were doing when they were writing things down? What did they imagine they were doing? And as you get into it, it becomes really clear that most contemporary accounts of who was Homer, where did the Iliad and the Odyssey come, they're just wrong. They're wrong. They're modern hallucinations based on what would we have done? What stories do we like? Like a single blind poet traveling through Greece, memorizing vast amounts of material and reciting it is not where the Iliad and the Odyssey came from. And Gilbert Murray gives you the evidence, which he says is abundant. He says, for one thing, they were still editing the Iliad during the Peloponnesian War, centuries after Homer. They're inserting whole sections into it, whole passages. They're just like, ooh, this would be cooler if, at this point they were on a plane and this thing happened. So they just write it in there. They just insert it into their text. These poets, these epic poets in Greece, were going to the Olympic Games and the other 3, every 4-year games. Every year there was one of these games from one of the different cycles. And poets would go there and compete for their ability to attract the audience's attention and to make really outstanding versions of the stories that everybody thought they already knew. And to make those outstanding versions, they had to not only keep the best parts of earlier drafts that people knew, because if you don't, if Luke Skywalker doesn't fight against Darth Vader with the lightsabers in the dark room, you do not have the Empire Strikes Back, right? If you forget that scene, no one's going to like your version of Empire Strikes Back. But that didn't stop these poets from saying, what would make this scene cooler? What if Darth Vader says that he's Luke's father? Let's insert that. Maybe it wasn't there in an earlier draft. This is, by the way, George Lucas originally didn't have Darth Vader being the father of Luke Skywalker. He invented that later. It wasn't there in Star Wars. There's a reason why Luke and Leia are kissing, and it's not incest in the first movie. They were not related in the first movie, but by the time he got to the second one, he's like, what would be cool if Darth Vader was the father of Luke Skywalker? So he inserts this into his script to improve it. Now, when you make those sorts of insertions, interpolations they're called, it leaves seams. Why are Luke and Leia kissing so much in the first movie if they're brother and sister? Is George Lucas some kind of pervert? He's like got some kind of incest fetish? No, he changed his mind, right? But if you are imagining the work as being dictated in its entirety, complete from the godlike mind of George Lucas, according to his ineffable plan, then you have to somehow reconcile the romantic relationship of Luke and Leia in movie 1 with the fact that they're brother and sister in movie 2. And people have done this for decades, come up with all sorts of convoluted explanations. But if you know that that was not originally part of the text and that Lucas inserted it after spending a bunch of time reading Joseph Campbell's Man with a Thousand Faces and so forth, and starting to think, what would be cool is it would be cool if it was all one big family and there was this operatic dynastic tension. So he changes his story, but he leaves there's seams left in the text. So what happens? On the one hand, if you're looking for an internally consistent thing that doesn't have any contradictions, you're going to be disappointed because there are contradictions. The process of editing, when you don't have a professional editor helping you, is very, very hard to do without leaving seams and scars in the text. So there's disappointment there. But on the other hand, smart, creative, motivated people engage at broken moments like that. They want to fix it. They like the work. They want it to be better than it is. And so they get in there and they try to repair it. They try to fix it. And you get this creative explosion that happens around very cool but incomplete or broken things. I think I mentioned the week before, or possibly the week before that, how that happened with Dungeons and Dragons. The original Dungeons and Dragons books, now it's a worldwide role-playing phenomenon. But in the early 70s, it was just some guys who liked to play together, and they were making little hand-typed Xeroxed booklets for each other. And it was full of seams like that. I mean, they were just cobbling the stuff together and passing them around with, for friendship's sake. But all those seams, once they published them, caused an explosion of creativity in the late 70s as other smart, creative people engaged with the game, found the seams, and then struggled to figure out, how do I improve this? How do I fix this broken part? And they came up with different solutions to the broken part. And so you get this diversification of creativity that's all springing from a common, very promising, but incomplete source. This is one way to think about the medieval epoch in a nutshell. If all of the literature in medieval Europe can be thought of in some way as a reaction to, or a response to, or an extension of, or an attempt to help along the Bible, whether on the Jewish front, whether on the Christian front, or on the Muslim front, with the addition of the Quran and so forth, then you can sort of see how and why, despite the fact that the central goal of the religious empire was to create a uniform orthodoxy that everybody would adhere to. And they pursued that with great conviction and violence, right? And that's one of the stories of the medieval epoch. The other story of the medieval epoch is about trying to make things better and trying to engage with things that you love and bringing your creative faculties to the challenge of, how do we make things better than they are? The editor's mindset, the fanfic mindset, I don't quite know how to put it, and maybe we'll be exploring that for weeks to come. But it's one of the main themes of the medieval epoch, is this idea. Later in history, everybody's heard of Machiavelli, of course. Not as many people have heard of Guicciardini, which is a pity. Guicciardini deserves to be better known than he is. Let's see if we can give you a Wikipedia reference for Guicciardini. Let me just type it in here. My wife got a degree in history long ago. Here he is, Guicciardini. Francesco Guicciardini. Let me put the link in. Francesco Guicciardini. Am I spelling that correctly? I'm spelling that correctly. Francesco Guicciardini, right? And you should have him beside Niccolo Machiavelli. What they taught them in history, as in their pursuit of a history degree, is that in the Renaissance period there was a tug of war between two competing theories of history. And how are you supposed to tell history? And one theory, the dominant theory, and it has been dominant for thousands of years, is that the purpose of history is moral education. That is, you are attempting to use history to produce a useful result here and now. For example, to teach people how to be nice. Or you might be doing a history to teach people how to be better at war. Here's the tactics that were used in this battle. Or you might be doing it so that something isn't lost, so that it's recovered, so that it can be useful now. Like here's, Archimedes' screw, which you can use to move water with very low energy from a low place to a high place. So in other words, it's a kind of pragmatist approach to history, in which history's only value is what you can squeeze out of it. So Machiavelli is using examples from history to try to educate his moral principles in The Prince and other works that he did. And that was the dominant approach to history. If you read works from this era, and going back into the medieval period, you read historical works, you can see that they're, Froissart and others, they're very concerned with, I need you to learn a certain lesson, so I'm cherry picking from all of the history and I'm leaving most of it behind. And I'm pulling out this piece because this piece reinforces the lesson I want you to learn. Right? You with me so far? This is going to come full circle. So in Rise of the Greek Epic, Gilbert Murray says that the authors of the Iliad, and there were many of them over centuries in Greece, they kept writing all the way into the time of Alexander the Great, into the time of the Library of Alexandria. They were still editing the Iliad. He says what they were doing was they were harvesting great phrases and characters and events from all of the other epics that used to exist in ancient Greece, like the Thebaid about ancient Thebes. Corinth had its own epic. Argos had its own epic. Basically all of the polises, each of them had their own epic. That said, why does this polis exist? How did we get here? Who was our founding father that we're derived, our founding family that we're derived from? What is our value system that we care about? And the authors of the Iliad were trying to create a pan-Hellenic consciousness among the Greeks. What if instead of just being politan, you could be cosmopolitan? What if you could start to think of the Hellenic peoples as an entire people and not just I'm an Athenian or I'm a Spartan and let's fight, What if you could try to cultivate that consciousness? We see it appearing in Socrates, who talks about being a citizen of the world. We can see it in Diogenes, who actually coins the phrase cosmopolites. My polis is not Athens, my polis is the cosmos. I want to be loyal to the whole world and all of humanity. I want us all to be concerned with each other and our well-being. This is a rising consciousness during the ancient period. And the creation of the Iliad was done with that in mind, says Gilbert Murray in Rise of the Greek Epic. He says, it was part of the Olympian project. The founding of the Olympics was directly related to the creation of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the goal is, let's take the best events, the best characters, the best passages and poetry from all of these epics and put it together into an epic that isn't about one city-state. It's about all of us together. It's about the people who founded the entire Hellenic civilization. Our forefathers, the Mycenaeans, what frequently called the Achaeans in Homer's own work. Let's make an epic about what they did and where they did it that's so impressive and emotionally moving and value laden that no matter which Greek polis you live in, it's relevant to you and it's memorable and it makes you feel a sense of identity and it helps to shape who it is you are and what it is you're going to try to do in the here and now. So they were not trying to document what actually happened on the plains of Troy. Right? Contrary to what was believed by the people who discovered the ruins of Troy in the 18th century, the people who wrote, the Iliad were in no way trying to describe this river is here, that bay is here, these plains are here, because they stole those passages like from the Thebaid. It's a whole passage about the plains of Thebes in the Thebaid. It talks about where the seven against Thebes fought their battle against the city fathers. And the creators of the Iliad just snipped that part out and dropped it right into the plains of Troy. It can't possibly describe the plains of Troy because it was a great description of the plains of Thebes, right? And the people who were doing that saw nothing wrong with it. They weren't lying from their perspective. They were improving the reception of the public to this great work, the Iliad, that needed to be persuasive to people to bring the Greeks together, to help reduce the amount of civil war, to help reduce the amount of fighting between the polites, and to get people to think about a pan-Hellenic consciousness, a cosmopolitan mindset. And that goal was so important that any details of the truth sacrificing them was not only acceptable, it was your duty. Of course you had to do that. This thing has to work. It has to be persuasive. If it's not persuasive, the Greeks are going to tear themselves to pieces. They know it. They can see how combative they are. Nietzsche writes about this in his essay Homer's Contest, which, if you haven't read, that's another one that's on Kenneth Smith's reading list. Homer's Contest, in which he talks about the way that the Greeks are trying to figure out how can we keep ourselves from ripping ourselves to pieces. It's the greatest existential challenge we face. So with that as the goal, of course you're going to sacrifice details like, was this river there, or was this plane exactly this shape, or, why not? Those are much less important considerations. I mean, it's not going to do you any good to get the details right if your civilization rips itself to pieces. So this is their value system. And Machiavelli is writing still history according to that value system. And as Beverly says, what she learned at Pacific Lutheran University in the history degree is Guicciardini was bringing forth an alternative theory of history that said, no, what actually matters is what actually happened. That's the most important thing. If you lie in the service of a greater truth, you don't know whether or not you will successfully pursue or advance that greater truth, but you do know you will have successfully lied about the details. So the harm you do is guaranteed, whereas the good you do is speculative and imperfect. So Guicciardini says, it's time to stop messing with history that way. It's time to focus on describing what actually happened as accurately as we possibly can. And when it comes to moral education, that's what you should be drawing from, that body of accurate, honest literature. That's the important thing. So yes, as Stephen points out, this is still an issue to this day with our political parties, who routinely lie to each other and us all the time in pursuit of getting elected, because what could be more, if I can't get elected, nothing else matters, right? The important thing is that I get elected. We'll hash out the details later once I'm president. That's what each candidate says, right? So this is a recurring theme, but here's the important part. I'm about to stop going on, and I'll go to hands in a moment. But this is the important part of what I'm trying to pin down here. What Gilbert Murray says is happening at the time of the Iliad, the time people are writing in the 500s BC, 400s BC, 300s, 200s BC, 100s BC, what they're writing then, the approach to writing, continues for the next 2,000 years. Because we get to the time of the Renaissance and they're still debating whether they should stop lying about history. Lying for the greater good is still the norm. Guicciardini is considered a weirdo. He's an upstart with a crazy idea. And at least half of the people writing history are not convinced by Guicciardini's argument. Of course, the moral education is the important thing that matters. Details don't matter. The truth doesn't matter. Only the capital T truth, which is the ideology I want to get into your head. That's the important part. The lowercase truth of whether what I'm saying is complete bullshit or not, that doesn't matter, right? I can lie in the service of the truth and it's considered, good and my duty. And that's been the norm for a long, long time. So that's the framework in which people are writing the Torah, right? That's the framework in which they're writing not only the books of Moses, but all the later histories and chronicles. That's the framework in which people are writing the Gospels and the epistles, in which they're writing Acts, in which they're writing Revelations. All of these works, the epics, the holy books, everything is being done with an eye towards promoting an ideology that is believed will lead to something, a very important good. And that in the pursuit of reaching that important good, everything, including the truth, can and should be sacrificed. If you can make the story better by changing the details, then you're supposed to change the details. Right? And it's it's also clear he changes the events. The authors of the Iliad changed the events of the Iliad too. They're trying to make a point, right? They're still writing during the Peloponnesian War, and they really like it if Athens and Sparta would stop fighting. I mean, that's what Thucydides has on his mind when he's writing his history. And so they're making pointed lessons here about why the Greeks shouldn't be fighting with each other. They're whatever they can do to make that argument, they're putting that into the Iliad. And it's why, as Thucydides says in his introduction to the history of the Peloponnesian War, he says, the reason I'm writing this history is because I think this is not only an enormously important war that is happening, I think it might be the most important war that has ever happened, the Peloponnesian War. And that means he's claiming it's more important than the Trojan War. And that claim, in turn, is like blasphemy to the ancient Hellenes, who were being united into a common people with the story of the Trojan War. And to say that this founding story isn't as important as what Thucydides is about to say is a really big deal. I mean, it's why a modern reader can't get the sense of, dear God, did you just say that any Greek would get reading the introduction of the Peloponnesian War. And it's why throughout the whole process of it, Thucydides has structured this thing to constantly make parallels between the things that Athens and Sparta are doing now and the things that the Mycenaeans and the Trojans were doing back then. Parallel after parallel after parallel. The thing is a poem. It's a song. He's making a moral lesson, and he's using the details to try to illustrate it. That's how people wrote. And that's where we get our Bible. And you can see then why it would be full of seams and inconsistencies. Because people have been, in the early centuries, they were editing it to their heart's content to try to serve the greater good as they saw it. And that meant sacrificing lots of little details, like, did Paul actually say that women should be seen and not heard? Well, maybe not, but to the orthodoxy of the second century, they really wanted women prophets to go away, shut up and sit down and obey their husbands. So they put the words in there, and they said that Paul said it because they thought that was how they could get women to, be subservient properly. And it caused thousands of years of confusion with people who thought that Paul was some kind of misogynist, until the modern textual analysis could show Paul never actually said that. Paul was not a misogynist. Paul thought women were awesome. All right, I'm done with my initial thing, but I needed to do this kind of retrospective because I was reviewing where we left off with the Greek stuff when we turned to the medieval stuff, and this issue of why do people write a book? What are they up to when they do it? I knew we hadn't really covered it appropriately yet. All right, Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, you gave a very, very broad view. That's actually the grounding for mythos or logos, actually, in a funny way. And so, I want, since we're early, still in the medieval period, I really want to go back and tie it up to Plato to a certain degree, how that what you just said relates. Because it has something to do with, I guess, the structure of systems and the conflation of that, of the version of that. And it came to my mind whether revisionism isn't part of the human tradition because we have limited understandings, and all we could do is revise history and to a certain degree lie about it to keep recentering it in the direction of truth. Now, of course, you go lie in the wrong way, and then it goes completely off scale. But because you don't have access to that, and it seems to me what the medieval got was Platonism, was not Plato. And because Platonism, as it's interpreted in a way, was an access to a kind of a universal divine concept. And that really neither Augustine and God. I mean, to hook that up. Because God tells you the truth and the Bible says it, there's no way of diverging from it because that is what actually the truth is in big capital T, and not this little truth of telling like divine lies or something, positive lies. No more revisionism except for what the church says that God told them was the case. And I want to go back to Plato because it seems like it really gave birth to this myth in some sense because not only the myth, the allegory of the cave, but the divided line seemed to lead in that direction. However, when you think about it, and I was studying the Republic with a group, and I was actually surprised that as much as they try to pin down what justice is and the tripartite soul and how that embedded in the city and so forth, people did not focus on the very, very beginning of of the story, right? In fact, almost the first sentence, the topic sentence. The first thing you need to know, and this is something I learned from my teacher, but it really struck me, is that Athens is really three cities because Athens itself is where the Athenians live, and Piraeus is where the traders or the foreigners live because Athens was a trading city with a large ship and navy and all that kind of stuff, and so things were important. And in fact, they built a wall between Athens and Piraeus, which really angered the Spartans because you shouldn't have a wall, because that was a very good strategy tactically, because you could outlast them attacking you because you always get your food and everything else sustenance from Piraeus, right? Okay. And so my thought, and then there's a third city, which is Acropolis, where the gods live, particularly Athena. And the question becomes, in the first sense, yesterday I went down to Piraeus to attend a festival. Okay, right? You might ask yourself, first of all, what festival is that? Oh, it's a festival of a foreign god, a barbarian god, right? Why isn't uh, Socrates, which is the protagonist, ascending to the Acropolis to light a fire in honor of Athena? That would be the right thing to do if you're Athenian, to praise your God, your values. But he went down, and in fact, he's almost a traitor in a way. He's saying, maybe I could learn something from a foreign god. You know what I mean? Maybe there is wisdom, maybe not, but the possibility is there. So right away, that's already a cosmopolitan view, not necessarily an ascending to the vital line to the divine truth of God, but something that collect possibilities. And they so the seminar consists all this argument about what justice is and all that kind of stuff. That was underpinned by the fact that he's going to go talk to a foreign god. I mean, like it undercut the whole damn you know uh, 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 piece
Yes.
by contradicting it, by him saying that you can't really believe everything you hear here because we're talking about something else. There's some subscript underneath it that undermines it altogether. And in some ways, what that says is the relationship between mythos and logos,
Yes.
right? That it did not go all the way to logos. It was still in the process of mythos. The mythos was always operating in some sense because that is the way that human beings are. We're living in a structural relationship between the relationship in mythos and logos, and you can't eliminate one and go to logic, pure
Yes.
and simple. And and so therefore, in some sense, this then gets back to the thing I wrote about the what is it that that spoke about the painting, the Renaissance Baroque painting,
Mhm.
uh, in which people were, the painter was saying, like, I can't seem to get out of the system. I'm trapped within the system,
Mhm.
you know?
Mhm.
And Plato, right from the beginning, is already undermining.
Yes.
Do not get yourself trapped in the system. You
Yes.
have to be able to see beyond the system. In fact, the mythos is the way out of the system that you're constrained by. And so when you had the Renaissance perspective, it was so mathematically precise that it really made it so that you are trapped within the logic of the system itself, whether in the fact that the system is good, it's productive,
Mm-hmm.
but don't get trapped in it
Mm-hmm.
because underneath the system is the ungrounded ground that in a sense allows you, because you are not a divine being, you are a human being that in a sense is always flailing around in the possibilities.
Yes.
So Plato actually said that, but it's like everybody else took Neoplatonism as Platonic, which is just half the truth, just
Yeah.
half the equation. And
Yes.
in fact, the fact that he wrote the whole thing, not as a treatise, which he should have wrote if he really wanted to do that, but he wrote it as a play,
Right.
like, while he's
Right.
criticizing the playwrights. I mean, like, what the hell? I mean, like, why don't
Yeah.
you write a treatise like
Yeah.
you should? Or actually, even better, a mathematical equation and just
Right.
be done with it. That's it. So
Thank you, Phil.
this actually saying there is still room for logos, and this to teach you to think about human relationship. Wisdom is not exactly the same as truth or divine truth, or you could say divine truth, but not God's divine truth. So there you go. So the whole thing about the Middle Ages was, in a sense, the reduced Plato, because they needed Plato to help substantiate it, but the reduced Plato to Platonism that supported God, Augustine and God, and therefore, in a sense, constrain you into the box. And there it is, the box is the Bible.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, it's interesting the amount of grief that Plato and Aristotle get today for the things that the medievals did with what they said, as though Plato and Aristotle had intended that.
Yeah.
Right? So you take an era, 1,000 years, the medieval epoch is obsessed with the issue of orthodoxy. And they're obsessed with it because if you get it wrong, you're going to burn in hell, and you might burn right now on a stake. So you can't afford to get this part wrong. And yet the orthodoxy has seams in it. It has problems, scars, and they can't. The more intelligent and creative you are, the bigger a problem those difficulties within the text are. And so the question is, how do you reconcile them? And they have to be reconciled. I mean, heaven and hell, everything hinges on whether you can get this right or not. So you can see why when the stakes are turned up to infinity like that, the infinitizing effect of eternity in your calculations, you can see why they wouldn't hesitate to repurpose Plato to purposes that Plato himself never would have agreed to, or to repurpose Aristotle to purposes that Aristotle maybe never would have agreed to. And part of the reason that they do the repurposing is conscious. They have to fix this theology and get it to work. But part of it's unconscious.
But particularly Aristotle, because Plato, you could sort of see that there is almost a line that you could follow in a way
Sure.
that leads to that. But Aristotle studied with Plato for, I think, 25 years, and he sort of rejected Plato. He kept the forms, but he rejected Plato, and he didn't have, they reduced him into a Plato of sorts,
Yes.
something of Plato, and so therefore they had to reduce uh, the uh, the the exclusion of the middle.
Yes.
The exclusion of the middle. So therefore, it's only a yes or no, a black and white. That's it. The dialectic, and that's you reduce Aristotle by throwing away the middle. Then you don't have Aristotle.
Because the middle's the interesting part in Aristotle, right? He basically is the scientist of the middle, right? His golden mean really investigates the question of these kind of spectra and where does virtue lie between an excess and a deficit. So
you just have to reduce him to a pupil of Plato. I mean Platonism, and there you have it. That's it.
But part of the thing is that in one sense that the people like Augustine and Aquinas who were messing with Plato and Aristotle to make them into buttresses for the medieval theology. In some sense, there's a dishonesty to it because they're breaking the original intent. But there's also an innocence to it. And innocence is that when you are a captive of an ideology, when you belong to a worldview, there are things that can be right in front of your eyes that you can't see because your ideology has no place for them. That they're not the kind of thing your unconscious will let you notice anymore. Now that you've been properly propagandized and ideologized, you get to the point where you don't have to consciously edit Plato or Aristotle to make them fit your theology. You look at them and you can only see the ways in which they fit your theology. Or in the ways in which they don't fit seem like those aren't the important parts of Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah, I like the way you put in the buttresses to the system because
Yes,
that reminded me right away of the flying buttresses. Church was not designed with flying buttresses. They added that because
Yes.
the engineering needed, and it became a substantial part. And we almost see it as beautiful,
Yes.
but it wasn't part of the structure. So they added Plato and Aristotle as a flying
Yes.
buttress to the
Yes.
system,
Yes.
which is interesting. The church even invented the flying buttress. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I was definitely thinking along those lines when I used the word. So anyway, thank you for that, Phil. Hey Zella, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
How's it going, Rick? Yeah, I'm in my second year of learning Hebrew, and one of the instances of the second year is how did we get the Hebrew text? And one of the instances that it's being discussed is that the Hebrew Bible is not just written in one type of script, the way that we know Hebrew today, what it was called the square script. It actually resembles a more figurative, what would be more of what they would call Paleo Hebrew or ancient Hebrew. And so most of the text that for a very long time we were relying on the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, where vocals were added by adding points and figures on the actual square script. It was the text that most of the translations were being dependent on until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they actually, the book of Leviticus is actually in Paleo Hebrew, in the most ancient form of the Hebrew text. And that shed light as to why there was certain variants in the Hebrew Bible, because sometimes the Paleo Hebrew, the difference between one letter or another is just the length of the little tail in the resh, or in comparison to another letter. And so if a scribe was copying and he didn't see that that individual writing the resh didn't write the tail long enough, he would compare it to a different letter, and that's how you get variants in the ancient Hebrew Bible, right? And so for a very long time, scholars were skeptical that even what we have today, how do we know that the ancient Hebrew that was then updated so that the Israelites throughout history could understand it? They were skeptical that we actually had a translation faithfully of the ancient ideas or the ancient text to the more modern period of 500 AD, right, where the Masoretes come and modernize the text. And it turned out the Paleo Hebrew said exactly the same thing that we had in the modern Levitical text. And that was like a surprise. It's like, oh, wait a minute, our thesis that maybe there were some interpolations and inventions and corrections might not been the same. Now we had empirical evidence that the actual copying from the ancient Hebrew text to the modern Hebrew text is actually pretty faithful. And so, in the sense, when I hear when you mentioned, and let me put it in this perspective, I think the perspective that Gia Cardini is espousing, in my opinion, it's a postmodern worldview. It's the idea that there cannot be any divine preservation of texts because it's only humans involved in the copying and transmission of ancient uh, uh, sacred text. And I think that's an important thing, that as someone that is in modernity, where there is no such thing as revelational knowledge, God cannot intervene and preserve text. I think that leads to the idea that, how do we know Paul wrote Paul, right? And you mentioned that that there's been textual analysis that Paul didn't write in Corinthians and Timothy about women not being able to have positions of power within the church. But all of the text, all of the Greek text in the debate between Bart Ehrman and Wallace, which are one of the two leading experts in the New Testament criticism of the ancient Greek manuscripts, all of them have that text. There is no one Greek manuscript that doesn't have that text by Paul. And so I think we also have to consider that scholars input their unbelief into their modern day scholarship, and also are sloppy with how they have treated, for example, the New Testament. For example, Bart Ehrman, and Bart Ehrman is an interesting case because he writes books for the general population, for the mass market, and then he also writes books for people that are scholarly. They're like into looking into the footnotes and all of that. And when he writes for the public, he makes assertions that says, we don't know who the real Jesus is. The real Jesus has been corrupted. And then he debates scholars like Daniel Wallace, and he tells them, don't you agree that the New Testament manuscripts that we have more veracity in their transmission than we ever have anything for Plato? And he says, yes. So would you agree that what the New Testament writers have written down actually indicates who Jesus was? And he says, yes. So, and then Wallace has asked him in this debate that I posted, so then why do you tell the regular people that there is no way to know the historical Jesus? Oh, well, I gotta sell books, Daniel. I gotta be sensational. And that's one of the things that I'm like, wait a minute. According to Bart Ehrman and Daniel Wallace, when you compare the New Testament ancient manuscript tradition to, for example, Plato, we have no original Greek sources from Plato. They're all medieval manuscripts. And you compare that to the New Testament manuscripts, and we have like 10,000 manuscripts by now that date closely, either 50 years or at most 60, 70 years after Jesus was walking. And you compare to what are the original manuscripts that we have to Plato, and they're millennia, almost like 1,000, 2,000 of separation. And so I think the scholarship, when we look at the scholarship to the three worldviews, modern day scholarship does not believe that God can preserve manuscript traditions. They do not believe that. They do not believe that there can be a supernatural intervention in the preservation of ancient sacred texts like the Bible. They completely write that out of the field, and they say there is no way that God could have preserved manuscripts. Because when we consider the statistics of variations and interventions, it only makes human reasoning possible that it has to not be the same as the original one. But wait a minute, why is that? And then you ask them, do you believe that God could intervene? Well, we can't prove God. And it's like, oh, okay, so you presuppose that God, first of all, maybe doesn't exist. And if he does, he does not intervene in the preservation of the manuscripts. So in the worldview that we're living in today, in postmodern day scholarship, there is an unbelief that that the Christian God can preserve the Bible, and that it's corrupt because of pure human intervention. And so I think we have to consider that as well, that we're living in an era where scholarship is in a state of unbelief towards divine intervention. And that's how we are told to understand ancient sources
Yes.
as unreliable from the start, because God cannot intervene. So I think that's important as well, to understand that modern day scholarship is under a worldview of
It is.
unbelief as well.
Yes. In fact, it's under competing worldviews because there are people who are sure that there has been divine guidance to the scripts through their entire history, and that it's impossible for anyone to produce a version that doesn't accord with the original intent. There are other people who take a naturalistic perspective who say there hasn't been divine protection, and that's the explanation for the variance. And this is an ongoing debate. One particular example that I think is interesting is Mark 16, which has two different endings. This is the famous story of the empty tomb in Mark. Mark is widely believed to be the earliest of the Gospels to have been written down, and that it is not the sole source, but it's certainly an influence on the remaining three Gospels and their accounts of the same situation. And what's interesting about it is that only manuscripts after a certain date include the longer ending. In the longer ending, after the women discover the empty tomb, they go and tell the apostles, about it. And that's how the idea is that is why we know the story of the empty tomb, is because the women went and told people. But none of the earliest manuscripts of Mark include that section. It's verses 9 through 20. It's called the longer ending. And verses 9 through 20 only appear after a certain date in the history of Bible transmission. Before that date, Mark always ends with verse 8. And at the end of verse 8, it says, the women were frightened and they fled from the empty tomb and they said nothing to anyone. The end.
Yeah.
And that's what it stops.
Yeah.
And you can see, people have evaluated these and said, well, how do we, first of all, it's a very different message if they didn't tell anybody than if they passed along the message to the 12 disciples who then carried it forward, well, the 11 surviving disciples who then carried it forward into the future. That's a very different message from they didn't tell the disciples and the disciples never knew that there was an empty tomb. It's quite dramatic that Mark ended the way he did in 8 because it contradicts all of the rest of the Gospels. All the rest of the Gospels say, for sure, the disciples found out about the empty tomb, and that became part of the message that they passed on to everybody else. But the original, or let's say the shorter ending of Mark, the earlier ending of Mark, says they didn't tell anybody. The disciples definitely didn't know.
And that's you're right. And you're right with that, because the scholarship says that there's the eventual, because the way that modern scholarship in regards to New Testament criticism, which is some area that once I retire, I probably want to major in.
Yes.
And that the idea is that there's the tension there. And for example, and the question is, do the later scribes who receive this manuscript, do they feel a tension to kind of relieve it instead of leaving it as a cliffhanger, right? We see the same story with Jonah, where he just sits there and waits to see Syria get destroyed or not, and the story ends.
The end.
It just ends, like he just sits there in a branch waiting to see, and then that's it. And it's like, okay, is that the end of the story? What happened here? And so in the sense that, and we actually do see that in the traditions of the text, that you actually could see that scribes come in and try to release the tension in the text. For example, I'll give you another example. And this is in the book, I think it's Mark as well, where there's a leper that comes to Jesus, and in the Greek it says that he was frustrated that he was coming to him. He was annoyed. And he said that he healed him out of frustration, like he was angry. Well, later scribes, because they want to present Jesus was like a nice guy all the time, right? He always had a smile and healed with people with a smile. They literally changed it from, and Jesus was angry and he healed them, to, and Jesus had compassion on him. Instead of out of anger, out of compassion, he healed him. And so what happened is that we can actually see that the context of that specific text in Mark actually has to do the fact that this Jesus told this leper, do not go and tell anybody, but
Right.
go and do what Moses told you. Go and clean yourself and
Yes.
present yourself before the temple, and don't
Yes.
tell anybody because they're gonna confuse me for a political rebel rouser. Well, that's exactly what he does. He does the opposite of what Jesus tells him. So it makes sense
Yeah.
that Jesus knew he was gonna do that, and he got angry. And
Yes.
so we're able to see that in the scholarship traditions as well. There's worldviews, right? Where the worldview within the scholarship of the text says it's not that we're missing pieces, is that we actually have 10 extra pieces.
Yes.
And the question is which one belongs and which one doesn't belong. And that's what textual criticism comes in and says, well, let's look what the text says. Let's look at what the grammar says. Let's look at the oldest manuscripts that we have.
Yes.
And let's look at the late, which ones can show a level of corruption and which don't. And
Yeah.
that's where you can see, even in that debate of scholarship, that there's belief and unbelief, right? Ehrman eventually, Dr. Ehrman, who was one of the leading scholarships in New Testament criticism, he says, I'm not a believer. And he says that has a part in the way that I view New Testament criticism. You bet at that I do. I don't believe God preserved the New Testament in any way, he says. I just don't believe that. And whereas Wallace, he's all like, it does impact how I view the text, because I look as to I have a 1,001 pieces instead of I have 1,000 minus one piece.
Yes.
The text didn't get lost, right? God preserved the message. And
Yeah.
that even there's a war within scholarship of
There is.
worldviews, you know?
It is. And the reason that there's that debate is not just from a difference in worldviews, but because the text itself contains these issues. So there's the two different versions of Mark. And so there's two possible explanations why there is the short, for many people, unsatisfying, but perhaps original version, and then the longer, perhaps more satisfying, but also perhaps not the original way it was told version, in which the women go and tell the disciples.
Or the famous one, the
And
woman
so,
caught in adultery. That
well,
one is known to be added to the text because
it
it
is.
appears all over
It is.
it appears in Luke and Mark, and when you read the original manuscripts, the woman caught in adultery is obvious that someone actually made up that story, and it was kind of based upon what they believe, the principles that Jesus created. And now it's included in your modern Bibles, and there's brackets around it indicating, yeah, this is not in the original, this is not in the oldest, most
Right.
ancient manuscripts. So in
Right.
that sense, and we're discovering the same thing for the Quran as well.
Yes. So, we'll have, the next couple of years to really explore this in some detail. So we don't have to get through everything today on this, but I'm mostly just introducing this topic because, people who haven't studied textual criticism of the Bible may not be aware of some of these issues that, of course, you know about, Zelig. I mean, you know more about it than I do. But this issue of that there are some variant readings in some interesting places is something that is easy to explain. It may not be the correct explanation, but it's easy to explain if we look at it from the perspective of how were all the other books in that era written? And the answer is all the other books in that era were written where people freely edited what the book said before it came into their hands. They kept the passages that they knew people were expecting to hear. They kept the most powerful and moving passages, and then they would freely edit. Like with the Iliad, they would freely insert new sequences that they thought would show the story and its morals more intensely. The same thing happened in the Odyssey. The same thing happened in all the other ancient Greek texts that we have. And the most extreme example of it is the Aeneid, which is one of the great works of classical Latin literature. And the entire Aeneid was made up because Augustus didn't like the actual origin story of the Roman Empire. He didn't like the story of Romulus and Remus, the brothers. He didn't like this whole, ignoble origins from a bandit family, kind of where did Rome come from story. And so Virgil just made him up a new story. He just from whole cloth said, oh, well, no, we were actually founded by nobility and they came from Troy, from the fall of Troy. We came from Aeneas. It's whole cloth. He just invented all of that. And it became the Roman epic. So, but it was to a good purpose, which is, he wanted to please Augustus. Augustus wanted to feel good about his empire. The Roman people needed something better to think about as a unifying ethic than our ancestors were a bunch of bandits who used to rob people, and eventually we formed a city.
No, and I'll give you another one that's along the same lines of adding a completely invention. Erasmus, in the I think it's in Revelation 21, there's like 6 or 9 extra verses. And when he was copying the Greek manuscripts to be able to translate them to Latin, he didn't have the sufficient manuscripts that had all the ending of the apocalypse. So what he did is that he wrote what he believed the ending was supposed to be in Greek, and then from that invention that he had in mind, then translated to Latin.
Yes.
And so many the King James version actually has Erasmus's new innovation and inventions
Yes.
of extra ending to the apocalypse that
Yes.
he invented in Latin, then translated to Greek, and then added to the Greek tradition. And so that's how a completely new text that doesn't exist by the most ancient apocalypse manuscripts was invented, and now every KJV person who owns a Bible and thinks that that's the word of God, that's actually Erasmus's.
It's the word of Erasmus.
Yes.
Yes. It's interesting, and so, we can, for the moment, set aside questions of whether this is God's plan or not. Because if his plan is ineffable, it's not for us to say. But what we can say is, here's what we have, and here's how it came about. And we don't necessarily know why it came about this way, but we can say, in some cases, we can see that it did. So one of the points Gilbert Murray makes in Rise the Greek Epic, it really changed the way I read any of this stuff. One of the points he makes in there is that you got to think about an era before the printing press, when every book that existed because someone spent enormous amounts of their life hand copying it. I mean, it's like, it is a long process to copy a work by hand, especially if you're trying not to make any mistakes. And if it's a long work like the Bible, it's like the work of a year or 2 years to copy that whole thing. And people are writing with, in the medieval period, they're writing with quill and ink, which it's, if you blot the page, you've ruined the page, you have to start over again. The illumination, the gold letters, all this stuff takes a long time to make even a single book. So Gilbert Murray's saying, the way to read this is that books weren't a commodity. They were as precious. If you had a book, that was as precious as if you were a magic user and you had a spell book. And this was the one and only book that had, the following 16 spells. Nobody else in the world knew. You were the sole possessor of them. He says, so on the one hand, you want to think about them like a grimoire, like this sacred relic. But on the other hand, he said, the way certainly the poets of the Iliad thought about the text of the Iliad was their class notes. The Iliad wasn't a book. The Iliad was a man standing at the Olympic Games and reciting as much of the Iliad as he could until he fell down or passed out or had to sit down and somebody else got up, and essentially he passed the torch to them and they resumed the poem of the Iliad from where he left off. The Iliad was this poetic relay race. That was the real Iliad. And the thing that was written down was just his notes to himself to remember. And so they would freely put in marginalia saying, I want to illustrate this moment with this. I'm going to add this new passage that I think will really make this point. Or like the way a preacher prepares what he's going to say in a sermon. He'll annotate what he might have said, a year ago or 2 years ago when he gave it, because now he's got new insights and he wants to insert them in, and he'll just put them in there as the margin notes. And when he's doing that, he doesn't think I'm lying. He doesn't think I'm desecrating the text. He thinks this is what I'm going to say today. That's what he thinks. That's the purpose of the book, is to help him remember what he's going to say. It's his notes. And so Gilbert Murray says, all these amazing early texts that come down to us, we want to read them as a modern commodity, like a book, in which we can argue over, did they have fidelity to the original publication? Or have they tampered with the original publication? And all that leaves out the truth that it was never published. There was no printing press. There was no publication. Instead, it is some kind of weird cross between a precious, precious relic and my personal notes for the speech I'm about to give. And that was the relationship that people had to these texts.
And I think also what needs to be considered is when you look at the Torah, right? it actually, what the reason that we call it the Old Testament, it's because it's a covenant or a contract.
Yes.
And when you read the covenant that Moses did with Israel in the 5 books, it actually ends by saying, "Cursed anyone who changes or
Yes.
adds to this covenant." Right? This it would be the equivalent of us making a contract with the car dealership.
And then
And
changing
then
the
later, and
contract.
changing it, you're
Yes.
gonna get sued. But in the Old
Yes.
Testament, it threatened you with curses, and all kinds. And then the same thing happens in the New Testament, where in the book of the Apocalypse it says, "Cursed anyone who adds or changes to this book." So I think in that sense, we have to understand that even within the ancient world,
There's a tug
they
of
had
war.
they had ideas that this is a contract where you come
Right.
to read the terms and agreements,
Right.
and you can't change it, because otherwise then you don't then you can't be held liable.
Right.
You can't hold the covenant makers liable, right?
That's
And so
right.
I think in that sense, sure, we can look at uh ancient literature in the sense that they were not trying to preserve the original text. But when you get to texts where there's contracts, the question then is, how were
Yeah.
contracts treated in the
Yes.
ancient world? Were they malleable? Can you change them? Can only one
Mhm.
party change them? And so
Mhm.
I think that's a part of the discussion as to how was the Hebrew scriptures and then the New Testament scriptures with the
Yes.
Jewish tradition that they come from, because they're viewed as contracts or covenants. Can they be altered at one's will? I think that's important as well.
I agree 100%. Yes. And when we'll get into the history in some significant detail in the weeks ahead, but there are two critical moments in the development of the New Testament when the contract orientation really hits hard into the middle of this freewheeling class notes tradition. And one of them is at the time of Marcion, and that's in the early second century, early to mid second century, and he was the first guy who said, we have too many epistles and gospels running around, and they all have different texts in them. We need to have a canon. And he set a canon. He made his choices about which of Paul's letters he thought were real. And I can't remember whether they said he picked an early version of Luke or something like that as his that was going to be his one gospel. And then he was done. He said, "This is it. This is the canon. The rest of it's all irrelevant." And it caused a crisis in the Orthodoxy because they didn't have the idea of a canon. They were just mediating between all these different communities that had their own gospels and their own epistles and so forth. And essentially, that was the first blow in what eventually led to the establishment of the canon a few centuries later. And by the time they established the canon, now, like Zelig says, they're thinking not in terms of the old grimoire / class notes approach to literature, but they're thinking in the contract approach, and they want to lock it down and be absolutely sure this is the word of Jesus, this is the canon as it is, and it's not going to change after this. So it's really interesting that big struggle that happens around the centuries leading into the launch of the medieval period. Until there's a canon, there's no medieval period. You're still in the ancient world. Everything starts to change around the time of the canon. But we'll put a pin in this for now so that we can get to other people's questions and of course eventually to the text. I'm anticipating about 1 o'clock by the time we'll get to the text. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, no, I mean, I actually appreciate you going through this actually, because I think that this really kind of speaks to really understanding the medieval epoch, and actually the evolution. So, we have this idea of the belief systems themselves that people have or espouse, and how that actually would impact, the stories and the evolution of these stories. Then you have the translations themselves, right? So then that's the actual difficulties that you can go through with, does this word match with this concept, and how do you reconcile those? And that's all very interesting. But I think the most important thing is to start to see as to the evolution as to why the stories evolve the way they actually do, right? And what is exactly going on. And I think that you have to evaluate people's incentives and their power structures in that process. And if you don't do that, then you're probably going to miss out as to why these translations and the way these the Gospels are even structured, and why translation is still a really important kind of battle today. So I think that what Phil said is that how this is also about mythos and logos is the most interesting part, right? So then everything starts to become grounded in logic. And as logic starts to take over and more, empirical evidence starts to become more important to people, and observational evidence, what they do is they start almost kind of testing these myths to a certain degree, the validity of these myths, and what are they actually saying. And in that process, what they evaluate sometimes is the motivations and how these myths actually evolved. And then the issue then becomes is that they become disregarded in that process. And when you disregard that process, there's an element of this wisdom that is actually getting lost while doing this. And so that's one problem. And that's a problem that modernity suffers from, where it's ignoring what is exactly going on in the ancient world and the wisdom that can be actually drawn out throughout the ages. Then you have the other problem, I think, that exists where people are trying to take these myths and use their wisdom, or even these, the approaches that Aristotle had taken, and you see Aquinas do this, is he really incorporates Aristotle. And a lot of people credit him with actually saving the church, so to speak, by incorporating, somebody that, was a materialist. So, so that by incorporating this, and he has all different ways of doing it, by, even how change is measured. Even his theories on transubstantiation uses Aristotle, right? And even revelation itself, revelation is revealed through reason, but it's divine reason. And so that you start to see the narratives and everything that change as to how this gets incorporated and distorted. That's another problem, right? Because then you're distorting the myth and you're actually narrowing the myth and what it actually was trying to espouse. So it's important to have this context, because ultimately the value, and to Zoli's point, is that, if you're starting with the idea, of that, well, that these could not have come from an intervening God. That's fine, right? But it's another to say there's no wisdom in any of these things, right? And meaning the Greek text. Now, you can say the medieval epoch that kind of more or less made it more monotheistic, and became where it started out, where you're starting out your set of beliefs and you're making everything fit that narrative. That's a bigger problem, right? And so but that's the problem that I was kind of pointing out before, is that when you take Aristotle and you just align it to this belief system and try and kind of make it whatever it is that, in order to maintain your power structure. And that's ultimately where I think that we need to evaluate is the power structure. So the key is three things, kind of like to evaluate the incentives of the power structures involved, in order to incorporate the narrative and change the narrative and to fit their approach, meaning like the church and things along those lines. But then there's this logic aspect of it as well, right? Where you can go too far to the logos. And when you go too far to the logos, then you're actually disregarding what the importance of myths are. So that's another aspect of it. And because that just disregards mythos altogether. And we've talked about this extensively here. We look at myth as being a lie, and that is not necessarily true. And that's another narrative that's actually false. So understanding the evolution of these texts, understanding the power structures, allows us to get to the heart of what it is that we actually should be recapturing. And so that's the third point, is that most importantly is that kind of having that context. I think that it starts to say, what is wisdom? And to Phil's point, it's this idea, it's not always going to be obviously in a logical system, or what is wisdom and what is truth. So, you know, that and knowing that is actually a really important point. So and you can kind of, again, you can see all of this, the evolution of this, but I really think that more importantly, that we keep in mind the context and the incentives of the individuals and the thinkers of the time in mind, because I think that gets to maybe where the distortions occur, and it can exist within modernity, and it can exist with obviously individuals that like are the church in the sense, in the medieval epoch in particular. So knowing all that is really kind of allows us to get to the heart of what the ancients and and then again, the belief systems, as far as people not necessarily, if you don't believe in intervening God, okay, you're going to have you're starting with a whole different
Right.
perspective.
Right.
And the translations themselves, that's an interesting point, and that's an important point to go through as well. But it does explain why the narratives evolve the way they do. And I think also really quickly, the rate at which the narratives, you know, it's that I think that what Phil said, you know, there's a revisionist nature to all of this in humans is accurate. I mean, there is a revisionist, but then you have to look at that. Why is it being revised the way it is?
Right.
And so then that kind of gives you that context. So anyway, that's a lot.
Thanks,
Nothing.
It's good though.
there was only one good point, but
no, there's more than one. But we're you know, we're going to work over this material a lot in the next 2 years because it's so central to everything that defines the medieval epoch. It's and at the end of that 2 years, I don't know that we will have put any of these issues to bed. I think all we will have done is like you're saying, we will have explored them enough to get a sense of the real complexity of the origin of this epoch and its development over time, because there's a lot going on that was more apparent to the time to the people living at the time than it is to us, and it makes it easy for us to misinterpret what they're saying and why they do the things they do. So it's gonna be
Kenneth does a really good job, actually, I think, of capturing this in general.
What does
Kenneth?
Oh yes.
I mean, in the sense of like the concept of God and how the concept of God had evolved. And then you can start to trickle down to all the other things that we just talked about, right? So that's the real beauty. And I think that this is actually a really important point, because I do think at some point that I think people try and use myth in ways that are in nefarious ways still today.
Yeah.
And he called that out.
Yeah, he really dilated my understanding of soul and spirit. I mean, when I first started reading Kenneth Smith, I didn't have anything like the appreciation of these topics that I do now. And I see now how much is lost when atheists try to say there's no such thing as soul or spirit. You can see how easy it is to end up in the behaviorists, I can do anything to you I want because you're just a machine kind of, you know, amorality that dominated the middle of the 20th century. These are tricky issues. And it's you know, Stephen's going to go next, but it goes back to an issue that Stephen has raised repeatedly. And I think when he first started saying it, I'm not sure everyone appreciated it as well as they appreciate it now, which is if modernity was launched with the understanding that we could be amoral in the way we design laws and science and mechanisms because we have Christianity to supply the morality. If that was the deal at the time of the Renaissance, then what happens if you subtract out religion and try to do the exact same thing, only with no God, no religion, no nothing? And, you know, there's a line between that and the Holocaust that is really uncomfortable to contemplate. But it has to do with how these things are woven together and what happens when you unweave them, and what is the structure of your axiology. Where does your ideas about right and wrong come from, and what happens if you snip that part out of the picture? What are you left with? It's this is all important stuff, and I think it's I think you're right. This is part of what Kenneth is doing for us in this book, and he's really not trying to say he's doing the whole thing. That's why he keeps referencing other writers. He's trying to point the way to the entire body of literature and history that we could spend the rest of our lives exploring, to kind of bring into more and more clear focus the larger picture of how the hell did we get here, and what freight are we carrying that we're not aware of, and what are we going to do about that going forward. It's interesting stuff.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I appreciate return bringing us back to this. I think that this is actually one of those critical things that, especially, yeah, when thinking about it in terms of even psychology today,
Yeah.
it's a really important part too. Anyway, but I'll let Stephen go.
Yeah. So thanks for your comments, Joe. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
This is a big question about the nature of scholarship, for example, about maintaining the truth of the text, observations, whatever, and then changing things, because people seem to have two things. They're very sentimental often. And this is the dichotomy between values and facts. Our sentiment is related to a lot of our values. And, well, what are the facts? And it looks like we've gone through different periods of scholarship here, that if there isn't stringent scholarship, then everybody's going to start rewriting everything in accordance with their sentiments. No, I was just thinking about something. There's a certain Marxist professor who goes to quite a few meetings, and he's always talking about equality and justice. And yet I noticed during the meetings that he hogs all the resources. For example, he'll take over the meeting. For example, I was trying to say something, and I can be a little bit long-winded, but I was trying to make a point about something, and the guy running the meeting was with that. And this guy tore through me about 4 or 5 times, move on, get on, move on. And this guy would spend 10 times the amount of time I do in the meeting. Then he's back the next week telling us about justice and equality. Now, I think there's a deal here, and it's a bit like the Glorious Revolution. We're trying to establish the great socialist paradise, or whichever paradise, maybe the 1,000-year Reich. We go there with that intention. Then we find, unfortunately, we have to kill a few million people over a few decades. But don't worry. The paradise will be worth it all. And I figure out, well, this guy must be operating like principle, because he's deferred the paradise of justice and equality. He's living now, he's hogging the resources. But don't worry, guys, this will all be for the great good one day, when we all live in the paradise of justice and equality. It's a very difficult one there. It's a very difficult proposition. But you look at, for example, our current news services. If I was to go back 50 or 100 years, there was a greater respect for what the facts were. No, it wasn't perfect, but there was still a very great and a much more honest respect for the facts. But you look at what's been in the news now, perhaps for the last 20 years or something. If I was to look at something written 35 years ago even, and the quality of the articles way above what we're seeing now. We are being treated to people who have scant regard for truth. And this is, like I said, we're going back to this big question in scholarship. What was the type of history of this regard for the truth, and those people who wanted to alter everything in accordance with their subjective values, compared to those who are more willing to stick to the facts? There seems to be two types of people. There's people who are very laconic, are much more willing to stick with the facts, and there are people who are very emotional, who insist that reality reflects their ideals at every point, and they will not suffer facts. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, those are important points to make. And, you know, it's almost one of the easiest ways to tell when somebody's ideology is about to take everybody way off the tracks is when they start playing math with human beings. It's one of the things I noticed when I was running teams doing medical software development is if you lose somebody from your team, they retire or they die, and you need another person because you can't keep up with the workload. If you bring somebody else qualified on, your work is not done. It's just beginning, because what you lost wasn't a quantity of labor output. You lost the quality of how they think about problems, how they interact with other people. There's a huge amount that comes with every person that's a member of a team. Taking them out, the remaining team is not just smaller, it's fundamentally different. It has to find a new balance to figure out, well, did that person used to keep everybody else's morale up, for example? And now that they're gone, everybody's depressed and their productivity is far lower than you would expect for removing one person from the team because that person was the heart of the team. And now you bring somebody else in and maybe they're twice the programmer the previous guy ever was. So your quantity, you know, is even better than it was. But maybe they're not cheerful at all, and they don't care about other people and how they feel, and maybe they're a negative influence on the morale of the team. So actually, the team's productivity goes even further down now that you've brought this, you know, cold genius onto the team. So there's this way in which, you know, in when you look at family dynamics and group dynamics and team dynamics, you can see that the qualitative aspect of human beings is often the deciding factor for if you're going to succeed or fail, far more than the quantitative. And that tells us the danger of treating people as interchangeable, you know, monads or units of production or units of anything else. So the moment someone says, yeah, I have to kill 10 million people, but after that, we're going to have a paradise, you know, right off the bat, you can tell they're doing math with people. It's the whole, you know, is it okay if one person suffers so that a billion people can be happy? And that takes us back to Ursula Le Guin's dystopia, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, which is, would you be willing to live in paradise if a child in a dark room somewhere had to be tormented for their entire life? And for many people, the answer is, of course. They would love that. As long as they don't have to think about that kid, they're perfectly happy having other people suffer for them. So you see that with Stalin and Mao and Hitler and everybody who does math with human beings. It's axiologically, it's bankrupt. It's morally bankrupt, even aside from the pragmatic stupidity associated with it. I love your example of the guy dominating the conversation and then saying he's all for justice and equality. And with that in mind, I want to apologize for doing something at the beginning of today's talk that I don't usually do. And that is I went on for 45 minutes. And I'm sorry about that. I don't normally lead off with a gigantic exposition. I don't really.
No, Rick, that was much appreciated. You had your point. You're bringing up free. That was, I appreciate that thoroughly. It's, you're the teacher. We're here to listen. Thank you.
Here, here.
Steven. All right, Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Phil says, where's my mute?
Yeah, it's let's see, how should I begin? It's well, yeah, I think I begin with the fact that if you don't have the absolute truth, you're dealing with possibilities. Then this came about with what's his name? Foucault, between the archaeology of finding the facticity. There's a vase, there's a shard, whatever it is, about the past, you have a fact. I mean, you can't deny that that thing exists, but you don't know what the fact actually means. And the genealogy. I mean, at the moment you find the fact, immediately you have a sense of genealogy. what is the process that produced this fact? How does that lay out the structure of being that exists in the context that it is? Number one, because without that, you just have you go to a museum, you see a lot of shards. Maybe once in a while you see a vase. You have no idea what it means. Somebody has to put it together in relationship to how the commerce happens, this, then that happens, and you get a fuller picture. Now, maybe those interpretations are slightly wrong, but nonetheless, you need to fill up the body that's in the corpus rather than just the facticity, which you don't understand. You just have a lot of junk piling around. You don't know. The other way you can look at genealogy is like, oh, these these objects, that these facts could have produced another possibility other than the situation it is as it is. And it seems to me what genealogy does is that you take the possibilities that was and how it could have emerged into something else. And I think every civilization is always in the front of using genealogy. It's like, this is the state of existence that we're in. How do we transform that into a forward progress? Or do we stay where we are? Or do we regress to something else? That takes into consideration of time. That led me to, in a way, phenomenology, and how in a sense, phenomenology is, in a sense, seeing your perception of how you relate, because that's a fact. That's a fact of our sensations. It led me to thinking about somebody called John Austin. John Austin wrote the book Sense and Sensibility. Sense and Sensibilia. His name happened to be parallel to Jane Austen, who wrote Sense and Sensibility. He's obviously trying to connect sense and sensibility, which is the internal psychological, psychic, humanistic relationship of understanding the structure you're in. You're sensitive not to somebody's response, that somebody's doing this or whatever, or even nature and relationship, how it is. And there seems to be, you sense that not just intellectually, you understand the diagram, but you have an immediate response in a kind of emotional relationship of all these things. And John Austin is kind of like an analogical person, but he's sort of in the left wing of that. So he's trying to bridge the gap. And he says, no, that's still, in a sense, just a kind of like psychological representation of things internally, or what it is. But in fact, the world reveals itself with sensibilia, which is a facticity you could grasp up. Okay? So there's a connection between the world itself revealing itself, and in some sense, your sensibility has a direct access to that, not just analogically, but in a way that fits. So in some sense, it's not exactly what like, well, what is this? Well, it's not exactly what Kant talks about, that all you have is a representation of the world, right? Through in a sense, the rose-colored glasses and certain concepts that you have. But in fact, there's also a direct link in relationship to your intuitions, your sensibilities. And that led me to, in a sense, what Heidegger was talking about. Heidegger, in his later writing, talked about the inner philosophy and the beginning of thinking, or the revision of thinking in a way. And he said, before you have this system of analytical thinking that produce everything in terms of a concept and lay it out, which in a sense box you into a conceptual relationship to the world, uh, you were in a much more primordial sense of receiving this information. And every time you receive the information, like if you're a kid or whatever, you go in the world, you first don't understand is that what is that? So the relationship between the whatness and transforming into thatness. Oh, that's a leaf. That's a that, you know? So he's saying that Dasein has the ability of disclosing truth, not absolute truth, but unfolding and disclosing part of it, because that's a transition of, let's say, grasping the whatness and slowly understanding the thatness into it. And there was this. I was just in this meeting that talked about who's the guy that's before Heidegger. I mean, like the active phenomenologist. Anyway, he talked about this thing called aboutness. You look at the thing and you're looking for the aboutness. What is that thing all about? You know, like, and so I'm wondering whether he's thinking the aboutness is really the bridge between the whatness and the thatness. Oh, that's about something that we could eat. We could cook as make apple pies out of. Oh, that's about that's what it is. It's a food product, it's a thing. And so in some sense, it's already revealing because we have a sensibility, that structure to have some kind of comprehension of the physical world through our sensations as well as the intellect. Okay. So we incorporate that. That led me to thinking about what is I forgot his name again. The artist who said, the problem with Bishop Berkeley is if a tree fell in the forest and there's nobody here, is there sound, right? Well, you could say, well, maybe you could put a recorder and there's sound waves. You could say, well, there would have been sound, somebody hear it. But sound is a psychological essential relationship that we have. And he said, no, that's not the more important question. He said, the more important question is that, is there human beings if trees never fell? We became what we are because we experienced the world through our sensibilities to the sensibilia that it access. So that relationship between that is that, human beings without God, he would say, well, what is being? Because he's asking, like, the disclosure of being, not truth. Truth is only a unfolding of partial unfolding of being, because the whatness is still, the thatness is still incomplete because there's still a lot of whatness that's left. So that's why you have to constantly explore it to find a deeper dimension. So there's always, human beings are always dealing with a kind of half truth, a half possibility. And so that's interesting, And I was also thinking of Derrida in a sense, but Derrida is so caught up in the textual relationship, rather than the relationship with the world itself. So he's always looking at the underlying structure of the text. It seems to me like the texts capture everything, he says. And what I liked about him is that he's trapped in the difference. He was saying you're looking for the difference or the contrast. But he says difference, and I think that's the important part. He says difference in the sense, not only difference, but he's referring by pronouncing it that way, I guess in French, that there's always a deferral to the truth. Because the truth is what is now, but is always incomplete and it's deferring to a further difference. So you always are pushing it off to the, so the horizon is always sort of withdrawing. So you're chasing the horizon, and uh, so he got a little too caught up in the textual relationship rather than being in the world. So which is the same. What Heidegger, I think, uh, the difference is the constant disclosure of being as you're
Yes.
catching up with the being rather
Yes.
than the deferring of the being, right? So in that sense, so that's why I want to relate that relationship. Uh,
Thank you, Phil.
Husserl is the guy,
Yeah.
uh,
Phil was
that in a
posting.
sense, the
Phil was posting.
aboutness is a relationship between uh, the whatness and the thatness. There's
Yes.
always a relationship that creates the balance. That's why your understanding is never a complete about what being is. You
Yes.
only reveal it partly. Okay, that's it. I thought I would say that.
Thank you, Phil. Appreciate it. Donna, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, yeah, everybody's understanding is not complete. And yeah, I want to go back to what you were talking about, Rick, about the different personalities that come into a group. And right now, I'm seeing a very quick historical perspective from going back 4 years and looking at the various people, some of these people showing up quite consistently. And by listening to you over time, I I get some perspective on the different people here, their personalities, what they bring forward, what experiences they do. And that to me is fascinating. The context of where your ideas come from. Um, I appreciate it. I have to say, Steve, he mentioned that he's long-winded, but he actually is often quite succinct. And actually, there are times when he said something, it's like, the succinctness is pregnant with further possibilities. And I've actually done a private chat to question, what are you talking about? What is that? What does this mean? That's a hard one, a private chat in this group, because there continues to be so many ideas coming forward that it's hard to break out. But I I really appreciate the different experiences, the different perspectives that all emerge here. I'm not trying to be a cheerleader here. I really see this, I appreciate it. It's the same way I experience artists throughout history and their retrospectives, how they've evolved, how they've developed. And I've seen some of that happen within the last 4 years. Only begun to see it, you know. I probably don't have to say anymore because there's a lot being said here. But because I have this perspective right now,
Yeah.
okay?
I
It was
appreciate you sharing it.
adding to what you were saying,
Yeah.
and there are certain players here who continue to show up, from day one. Very interesting.
It is, isn't it?
Yep.
See, you're getting the experience the way I get it. And I really pay a lot of attention to who's present and what they're adding and some people go and we miss them, and that there was elements that they contributed that just aren't happening anymore.
Yeah.
Uh and
And one individual could not provide all of this.
right,
Simply, it's not possible. Yeah.
right. I mean, this is effectively in miniature. This seminar is doing what Kenneth Smith is recommending in the book, which is you got to bring multiple perspectives to
Yeah.
all of these questions because none of us has enough of the picture. We just don't,
Hey,
and
Donna, are we singing in harmony? Or are we singing in cacophony though? I want
Uh,
to ask that.
so yeah, even the cacophony is interesting, isn't it? It's kind of stimulating, but
it is, it is. So
I
maybe,
mean, how could we ever, the people here? I mean, I would really wonder. I would be concerned if people always agreed and
right?
cheerleaders of it. It's like a child that's grown old and is continuing to be a cheerleader about other people's ideas.
Yeah.
No, I mean, none of us are children here in our lives and what we're bringing forward. And
Yes.
enough. That's all I have to say.
I appreciate it, Donna. Thank you. So with that, I'm going to take us to the text. All of this was our 2-hour wind up to getting into paragraph 8. And yeah, I knew Sharon would wave at me. Speaking of things that people bring, Sharon's like, we are getting to get to the text, aren't we, at some point? Yes, we are. All of this was the wind up for the text today. So paragraph 8's a long one. It comes in multiple passages, but all of this wind up was because, having read paragraphs 8 and 9, there were some things I wanted to draw our attention to. So I'm going to read some of it and then we'll talk about it. The Romans, both plebes or commoners and patricians or wealthy nobility, conceived that the will of Jove or Jupiter put an ultimate seal on their fated lot. The powerful and moneyed classes were bound to act according to their class interests. Sounds like Marx, doesn't it? Except this was just how Romans saw the world, is what Kenneth is saying. And the deprived and destitute many were bound to suffer according to theirs. And now when he uses that phrase, the many suffer, and the earlier bit about the money classes, he's quoting Thucydides. You know the Thucydides quote? This is the powerful do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. This was his characterization of the rot in Hellenic civilization that happened during the Peloponnesian War. You know, he saw that might makes right, and the poor just have to suffer whatever they suffer, not as the normal state of affairs for humankind, but as a sign that Hellenic civilization was in collapse, that it was falling apart. That was Thucydides' bold claim in the Peloponnesian War. So for sure, Kenneth is quoting that when he uses this particular phrasing. Oh, take care, Stephen. We'll see you next time. So then he says, what was true among gods and animals, the privileges of hierarchic rank, was no less true among humans. What is permitted to Jove is not permitted to a cow. Quod licet Jovi, non licet bovi. And I'd heard that quote for years. I mean, I think I might have first encountered it when I read this passage back in 98 or 99. And I was never sure what the hell he was talking about or what the Romans were talking about. How is this a saying? What are they saying? But I get it now. And it's not like he isn't being clear. I just wasn't in a position to understand it when I first read it. He's talking about fatalism, social fatalism. When a class system stops having class mobility and starts hardening into a caste system, then people start to feel fated, like they don't really have any choice in their lives. They become infantilized, right? They become pacified. So why bother striving if everything you do is just going to be taken from you or crushed? What's the point of trying to make anything better? And that, what he's alluding to, is it really underscores the point at which a civilization stops producing innovators, because there's no point in innovating. It's just going to be crushed or stolen from you. So people just they let their better faculties just atrophy from disuse when it's in a context of socioeconomic, political economic futility. And he's saying this is one of the ways that you know that the Roman Empire does not represent the ancient world at its best. And at its best, we're talking about Aristotle. How do you know what a cheetah is? Well, you don't notice it by looking at a cheetah that's had its legs cut off. You look at it by looking at a cheetah that's at its best, at its prime, and it will show you its arete, and then you will understand what a cheetah is. And yeah, there's variance, and there's going to be young cheetahs, there's going to be sick cheetahs, there's going to be all kinds of variants around that, but they all exist around that pinnacle of arete. This is Aristotle's argument. And if we take Aristotle's argument and apply it to Rome, we can see why Kenneth is saying Rome is not the representatives of the ancient world. It's the ancient world in a state of hideous decay. And one of the examples of it is that they've reached this point of class ossification that has led to just a collapse of creative innovation. There's a sense of futility. And it's not an accident that there's such a focus during this period on fortune telling, astrology. You know, what do the stars have to say? Are you lucky or unlucky? Oh, I'm unlucky. Okay, well then why bother? There's no point in trying. I'll just try to get through my life. That's the mindset in which Christianity is coming like a revolution to create the medieval epoch. And he's going to talk about that in the rest of this paragraph, in the next paragraph. It's not hitting people who are joyful and at their best and looking forward to the future. It's hitting a time when great masses of people are thinking that life is futile. They're primed. And this is Gilbert Murray's argument in 5 Stages of Greek Religion. He's saying people were already primed before Christianity arrived to they needed something else. What they had just wasn't going to cut it anymore. He goes on, religion, rather than tempering inhuman vices, merely ratified the course of an imperial juggernaut. And, you know, over and over, one of my favorite quotes, and Kenneth didn't even introduce me to it. I'd heard it before, but Kenneth really underlined it for me, is, you know, they made his extended quote about they make a desolation, call it peace, his critique of the Pax Romana. The longer one, he's talking about lying and cheating and stealing and raping and plunder, and to these they give the lying name of empire. They make a desolation and call it peace. That's Tacitus the Roman on Rome, on the Roman Empire, and its claims to represent the good and to be the right way to organize for the world. He says, you know, it is pursuing its own, not just worldly, but selfish, destructive interests, but then putting a veneer over it to make it seem pretty and shiny and good. And so there's a hypocrisy that's sort of sitting on top of sort of this ravening appetite. And that's Rome from Kenneth's perspective. And when he says religion, rather than tempering inhuman vices, merely ratified the course of an imperial juggernaut, he's contrasting it with what we saw in chapter 4 about the role of religion to be a cultivator of mythos, to give us a way to bring the difficult but important truths of the world and the value system into a form that is so approachable and memorable and persuasive that even the most ignorant person can be lifted up from where they start and can try to strive to be a better person and to try to do good things in the world because they've been exposed to these profound ideas in their most you know, influential form. It says that's the purpose of religion, not to, you know, to temper inhuman vices by pointing the way towards a better world and a better humanity, not just to ratify the course of an imperial juggernaut. So here he's not, you know, this is, it's interesting because as we talked about before in chapter 4, he has very little to say about Rome. Chapter 4 is ostensibly about the ancient world, but he mostly focuses on the Greeks, and he blows through Rome in just a few paragraphs at the end of chapter 4, even though that's an enormous part of the recorded history of the ancient epoch. Just passes right through it. Now we see why, because what he's going to do is he's going to talk about it here in chapter 5 to explain why there had to be the medieval epoch. He says the ancient world had dead-ended itself in this stagnation, and the stagnation lasted half a millennium of stagnation, right? Which was portrayed as progress because the empire kept spreading and spreading and spreading. So this must be progress, but it was a numerical progress. And in all of that, it was not leading to an exaltation of the possibilities for people in the world to do better. It was a dampening down of possibilities for people. So he goes on, the rule that Rome extended throughout the ancient world was unstintingly crass. I love the use of the word crass here. A bleak and crushing extortionary power politics, rooted already in the very founding of Rome by a legendary gang of brigands. So this takes us back to Virgil's Aeneid, which is the papering over of the origins of Rome to make it seem noble, because, you know, it was an embarrassment to the first emperor of Rome. The truth was an embarrassment. So better to make up a story. And in this we see, again, what a massive betrayal the concept of an epic is to the Romans versus the concept of an epic among the Greeks. You know, the Greeks may be rewriting the Iliad and the Odyssey, but the whole purpose of it is to say how easy it is to go wrong. The people who were the most courageous, who were the smartest, were the most passionate, who had all the virtues, wrecked Bronze Age civilization. It can be done. You can, if you just go at it as an individual and say me, I, you can, you know, with a bunch of other like-minded people, you can wreck the world, which is what the Iliad is saying the ancestors of the Greeks did. The purpose of the epic was as a warning to all humanity. Don't do what our ancestors did. And of course, the reason that they're revising it during the Peloponnesian War is, as Thucydides explains, it sure looks like, despite the fact that this is our core lesson, don't do this, here we are doing it again. We can't seem to stop ourselves. So let us take this moment to make the lesson even clearer. We're going to add the history of the Peloponnesian War on top of the Iliad to underscore how easy it is to go wrong with human virtue, with human intelligence, how careful we have to be to try to cultivate people who won't do that in the world. And instead, the Romans say, we're just going to make an epic that says, yay, rah, rah, Rome. We're so cool. Isn't it great to be Roman? It sure is. Then that's not an epic. You can put it in poetic form, and you can have all the tropes, like off of TV tropes. You can have all the epic tropes and all the surface of an epic. But what's under the surface is this crass, bleak cheerleading for an imperial juggernaut to try not to be crushed under its heels so that Virgil could get, imperial favor and not live a miserable life. Maybe Augustus would like him and give him some funding. It's like that can't be anything produced for that purpose can't really be called an epic. It's an epic, right? And so this is underscoring this question of what is Rome. He says, indeed, Polybius's or Suetonius's history of regimes in Rome reads more like the chronicles of the mafia than the civilized rule of law. And the Romans are saying one of the great virtues of Rome and the Roman Empire is the common Roman law will apply to everyone. No more chaos. We're bringing order to the world. But you actually read the histories, even Romans are writing about themselves, and it's clear that it's just power politics. It's just struggle, might makes right. Who can dominate whom? We talked about, I think it was about 3-4 weeks ago, we talked about Cicero and how there were these, what we often read as two political parties in Rome during Cicero's time. There were those who were, who were focusing on the best people, i.e. the nobility. And there were the populares were focusing on the mass of the population and their interests. Julius Caesar was a populare. He was appealing to the people, trying to get large numbers of people on his side to back him. And meanwhile, Cicero and others they didn't like the people. Said the people are ignorant and crude and savage. They make fart jokes. They hit each other over the head. I'm more concerned with what the best people do. Can we write in a literate fashion? Can we talk about values? Can we, all these sorts of things? And there's the struggle between them. And the Wikipedia article does a pretty good job. There's some other places that do better of making the point that it's a mistake to read these as political parties. They aren't political parties. Rome didn't have political parties. To have a political party, you would have to want to subject yourself in a loyal fashion to a reigning ideology. The Democrats versus the Republicans, Stephen would say if he was here. Which is your group, and what is my group's platform? What's our brand? Well, I'm gonna promote that brand. And they say the Romans didn't do that because they were all too self-serving to form political parties. They were more like loose, vague coalitions than they were a political party. They would turn on each other at the drop of a hat. It was almost like individualism turned up to 11. They couldn't have real politics because they didn't have what the Greeks had, which was the polis. And the polis is our tribes are going to come together and set aside our usual rivalries and focus on how do we survive together as a polis with one set of laws that we share together. And that's our personal possession. Each of us is personally invested in creating this shared code that will allow us to not have a civil war with each other. It doesn't have to be the war of all against all, right? We can try to make something bigger than the tribe. It's a new form of organization higher than the tribal level. But what Rome is doing is stripping it down below the tribal level. We barely even have clans or tribes anymore. You have Cicero writing for one side until he thinks it's in his best interest to switch to the other side, and then he writes for them. And then he gets pissed off at them, and he goes back to writing for the first side. Anything that will advance his career, anything that will add to his sheet of accomplishments, that's what he does next. And he's considered one of the best. one of the most virtuous and honest, certainly the most literate of the Romans, and he's blowing with the wind. That's as high as Rome gets, is, you know, libertarianism kind of, you know, it's like nothing more than that. That's the peak. So, you know, yeah, it does sound like the mafia. Who's the boss? What do we think we can gain if we support him versus switching sides to the other boss? The history reads exactly like that. It says, not by virtue, but by brute force, Rome triumphed over the autonomous Greek polis and their codes of communal values. To give the very concept of politics a radically more materialist and brutal or coercive meaning, that sense of politics that he's talking about here is the sense we have today. Right? You can find people who are romantic about politics, but the realists, the political realists, call themselves into realpolitik and Machiavellianism. They say that's all just a veneer, right? Politics is just war by other means. Politics is really about getting what you want. Whoever has the most money, whoever has the most power, whoever can persuade the most people and make the largest coalition, they win. And it's about winning. It's not a coincidence that the founding fathers modeled the US Constitution after the Roman Constitution. We've recreated Rome in the modern world to the best of our ability. And in doing so, we were impressed by the fact that they lasted so long, but they lasted so long as a blight upon the world, according to Tacitus. So why are we modeling ourselves on that? Well, you know, he's got his critiques of modernity, and we're going to be investigating this. I'll call on hands in just a second, but just to conclude the second third of the paragraph 8, he says, it is the cynical Roman worldview of realpolitik that dominates modernity, which finds the Greek politics as alien as their philosophy and culture. We read the Greeks writing about politics, and we don't really understand what they're saying because we read them the way the Romans read them, which is who won, who lost. It's a horse race, right? Like politics now, who has the most electors, who has the most votes? We're interested in the combat. So I'll stop there for now. We'll finish the last third of this paragraph later. Let's have Joe come off mute and tell us what's on his mind.
No, it's just interesting because we've had discussions in the past, even just how the interpretation of words, even like the idea of virtue itself, and how you were mentioning that someone like Cicero is considered the most virtuous, but it's most virtuous in the most practical sense, right? Not in an idealistic sense. So that it's like kind of a much more concretized kind of idea of what virtue means, even. So it's not about necessarily excellence per se, or something along those lines. It's about, well, what can I do to make this practical, right? So it's not an ideal any longer. It's about, you know, how do I execute? And so then the concepts themselves are kind of lost, and it just gets to this idea that how you can see how Roman functioned. I mean, even if you look at it, even the way they did perfect certain things scientifically. No, don't get me wrong, right? And they took a lot and made things practical, and even were able to expand upon what the Greeks did, geometrically speaking and industrialized wise, and even the way they use the arch and things like that. But all of those things, those are, things they did very well, but it also, on the flip side, they became very mechanistic in their approach, in the philosophical approach. And it's interesting to see, because then you start to see the behaviors that kind of mimic, some of the ways of even the ideas and the concepts that evolve. So it's an interesting way of kind of thinking about it, and I like the word, kind of unstingingly crass and bleed crushing extortionary power politics rooted already in the very founding of Rome by a legend gang of brigades. And that's an interesting way. I mean, it's a very interesting way of kind of phrasing it. Yeah, anyway, I mean, it's just something that had kind of occurred to me, is that how this distinction of even the idea of Roman governance and Greek governance where there was, it was kind of seen as more of a duty in Greece. And it was actually much more of a distributed type of power as opposed to a power that was seen that is kind of necessary. And you can also start to see the idea of assassinations start to come into play too, and how that type of behavior starts to manifest itself as well. So I don't, just a brief comment about, about how Kenneth is actually capturing that politics and how it's actually executed.
Yeah,
No pun intended.
that's right. Yeah, that sentence that you quoted, that stuck with me from the very first time I read this essay way back when. It's a hell of a sentence. It's basically a one sentence indictment of 700, 800 years of Roman history. Just bam, like that. It's intense. And the first time I read it as an arbitrary value judgment, because in modernity, all value judgments are arbitrary, and we're supposed to be objective and not make value judgments. We're just supposed to collect the numbers and the facts. But the more I learn about Roman history, the more I understand it to be a value judgment the other way. That is, it is judging the Romans according to the value they bring or don't bring to the world. And objective is the wrong mode. What it is it's focus. It's a doctor's focus on health. Was this healthy for us or unhealthy for us? And it's, I think, an accurate diagnosis of the effect that Rome has had on both the contemporary people, but also the course of history since then. What's fascinating now that I'm reading stuff to teach Latin, working on learning Latin, is that an enormous amount of it, especially the British and American books that teach Latin, often use Rome and Roman culture and history as an example, and they're almost unfailingly flattering. Isn't it great how big they are? Isn't it great how many things how strong they were? Isn't it, look at all the places that they took over. Isn't that great? And that they're saying it because the British Empire was doing the same thing when they were writing their little British treatises teaching Latin. And the same with, with the 20th century, early 20th century American treatises, like, yay, Pax Americana. There is this whole way in which they are just glossing over all the terrible things that the Romans did, all the really awful extortionate things, which is weird. It's like, I mean, you think of what would an analogy be? Are you being a cheerleader for Genghis Khan? Are you being a cheerleader for Stalin? Who are you
Right.
cheerleading here? What kind of people are these that you're saying, yay, this is so cool? And yet they wrote those things unironically, and then they were taught in school that way. All generations of school kids were raised to go, it's cool to be big. It's cool to be powerful. It's cool to dominate the world. Bring order to the chaos. Don't let people be different from each other. Stamp out the differences and make them all be the same. I guess I better go to the next comment. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Oops. Oh, sorry. Mute. I accidentally muted you, Phil. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether the empire, it's a natural development. I mean, Rome certainly helped it along. But I'm thinking back in history, like, what is the first empire? Well, certainly Alexander preceded Rome. Okay, so that's one mark, although he died, but he did leave an empire. But the Persians preceded Alexander. They were an empire. Okay. You might say the Assyrians, after the Bronze Age collapse, began to become an empire of its own. Okay. You might say that, okay, this would post-date that the Chinese was an empire, but it was an empire that was contained within China itself. There was many kingdoms that united into China. So was this an inevitability? I mean, in some sense, and I'm also thinking about the first serious relationship with empire was Julius Caesar, right? Before that, Rome, although it was kind of imperialistic, it was not an empire. It was still a republic, governed by by the Senate. And I don't know if they have a house or whatever, but they had a relationship with the Senate and the ruler, and those rulers were rotating. And so when Julius Caesar died, because it was clearly because of the case that they were afraid that he would become the imperial power, right? Cassius uh, put the knife in his back and he said, "Oh, you too, Cassius." In itself, you're against me as well. So then I'm thinking, well, that's kind of interesting because what after Julius Caesar died was Rome was still kind of a republic because there was three triumphants that took its place, right? There was Octavius, which is the who became Augustus. He was the nephew of Julius Caesar, inherited it in a way because he was adopted him as his son, but he was really not his son, but a nephew. And then there was Mark Antony, who sort of took the southern part, like Egypt and and part of Levant and maybe North Africa to a certain degree. And then there was what was the third guy now? There was I got it down here, Lepidus, who took part of the uh, Eastern Levant and maybe Anatolia. So there was three triumphants. So they were three supposedly generals. And it was, Octavius was really the minor relationship because he had inherited, he was the youngest. But he inherited from Julius Caesar. So he had to play along in a way, but he eventually defeated uh, Mark Antony, you know, and took over Egypt. I'm not quite sure when Lepidus fell, but nonetheless, and he became the first real emperor, right? In some sense, and he wanted to make sure that he was perceived as the good emperor, right? But the fact of the matter is, he became emperor because he used brute force to defeat these other generals, right? So, you could say he established the empire because he was the last barbarian to defeat the other ones. Okay, so there was an underlying illegitimacy about him, but he portrayed, and he was, in some ways, I still kind of think of him as a good guy, but nonetheless, I think it deteriorated from that point, and certainly after his death, like there was a series of really, really bad emperors that was very self-oriented, So in some sense, it just degraded from him. He kind of held it together to a certain degree, but the myth he portrayed, it was not the same as what actually was, because still underlying uh, the goodness of the sort of republic that
Yes.
still existed. It just became uh, underlying through power. So there you have it. So we inherit the Roman Republic, but we had underlying the structure of power in
Yes.
the United States and the rest, henceforth, so forth. Okay, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like it just suddenly happened. There was a transition, and certainly you had to come to power through, putting knife in Mark Anthony's back, so to speak. Okay, that's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, there's a couple of interesting details there to look at that in particular. I mean, it's good to go back over that history the way you did. A couple of things that jump out. One of them is there's the difference between an empire in name and an empire in fact.
Yeah.
So the point at which you're out conquering other kingdoms and folding them into your republic is a point at which you aren't a republic anymore. I mean, you might be a republican empire instead of an imperial empire, but you're an empire, right? You're looking to go a conquering. It's one of the things I really enjoyed. It was one of the early episodes of the HBO series Rome. And anybody who hasn't seen it, even though it only lasted 2 seasons, it's magnificent. It is, they really brought to life the everyday world of what it was like to live in Rome, including how colorful everything was. You know, the statues were painted, the walls were painted. It was not a marble white city the way that we always imagined it. But it's the scene when Caesar comes to his triumph riding the chariot, and he's dressed up in red like the god Mars. And the crowds are just screaming, they're cheering for him. And in that moment, it's really a visual representation of how the Romans have overthrown their own pantheon by pressing their thumb down hard on Mars to the exclusion of all the other gods. All the other gods have they're no longer counterbalancing the will to war. The will to war has become really the one god for the Romans, and the rest of it's just them going through the motions. And any republic that is at the point where, you know, Mars or his equivalent is their one god is not a republic anymore. I mean, they might be in name, they might be in structure, but behaviorally, they're in love with war. It makes me think of Aristotle and his writings about the forms of government, when he says, you know, with a republic, with a democracy, the critical thing is, do you have the good kind or the bad kind? Do you have the war of all against all, i.e. the Roman democracy, the republic, in which case it's the worst among the worst of all forms of government? Or do you have the kind of democracy in which people have a united conception that the purpose of politics and economics is to create a healthy society and for healthy people in a healthy world, i.e. sophrosune. If they are united in agreeing that they are in pursuit of sophrosune, the democracy or republic can be the best of all forms of government. But if they are not united in that, and instead they look at the purpose of politics and economics as to dominate each other, then you have a dystopia, effectively. And that describes the Roman Republic. It's a dystopia. Everybody's against everybody else. They're shifting alliances for personal advantage. And that's not only is that a bad form of government, it's an unstable form of government, because each person privately doesn't want to be one among many. Privately, they want to climb to the top of the heap. It's basically, that form of government is a big arrow that points towards empire.
Could I ask you a question about America itself? Because some people call it the accidental empire in this sense. Surely we did the wrong thing to the American Indians. There's no question about that. So we had certainly an interior empire. But American was pretty much isolationist. And World War I sort of drew him in. And in fact, Woodrow Wilson tried to create the League of Nations, although he abandoned it, okay? But after World War II, when we were forced to enter the world because simply the world was destroying itself, we were left with the fact the Soviet Union, particularly with Stalin, and we had to, in a sense, create an economic structure to squeeze the Russians, in a sense, and we created this certainly an economic empire that, in a sense, used the military to supplement that. But we are now withdrawing again back to isolationist thing. So were we a true empire that actually wanted to be like the British Empire, or were we just forced into a situation in which we created the United Nations in New York? And in some sense, we wanted to be, but whatever, we were forced into because nobody else would take the lead. And the British will continue to be, because there was a conspiracy between Stalin and Winston Churchill when they divided Europe. They agreed to east and north of Greece, the Russians would take, and they would let the British keep Greece, and south because the British wanted to protect the empire, particularly Egypt, and the Suez Canal to India. Okay. And Franklin Roosevelt was appalled. He was incredibly angry that they did this without his agreement, unknowingly, uncovered that. And that's, in fact, the structure we had at the end of World War II, because we had the Iron Curtain because of that, because of that deal. And it was only in 1956 when the Egyptians wanted to take back the Suez Canal, and the British wouldn't let them. The Americans intervened and said, "No, you got to let Nasser take back the Suez Canal." And
You
so,
had a question.
in some sense, that was, in a sense, a way of uh, eviscerating Britain from being a true imperial power at that point. And so, are we withdrawing to, in a sense, a nationalistic, isolationist relationship? Although we definitely had the Monroe Doctrine, so that was a
Yes,
little, certainly somewhat imperialistic, you know.
it was quite imperialistic.
I know, I know.
Yeah.
So,
And have you ever read Gore Vidal's book, his novel Burr, about Aaron Burr?
no.
It's, if you haven't, you should. It's a hell of a book. It's he did a whole series of books about US history that were fictional ostensibly, but in practice they were based on incredible research. Like the writings that he did about George Washington were based on him reading every one of George Washington's letters that still existed, which most historians of Washington never did. They were too busy looking at his, more public stuff. So his novels have all kinds of details about what life was like and what the founding fathers thought that they were up to that are missing from our official history. And the novel Burr is a good example of that. It has Aaron Burr very late in life. The protagonist isn't Aaron Burr. The protagonist is the young guy that Aaron Burr gets to come in and help him with his memoirs. And ostensibly, it's a novel about this guy interviewing Aaron Burr. Geneva asks which series room. It's on HBO. If you go to HBO, they've got a TV series room. It's 2 seasons. So this Gore Vidal novel, ostensibly the structure of it is this young guy who's looking to improve his fortunes is lucky to have landed this gig interviewing Aaron Burr and writing down his memoirs. But what's actually happening is Gore Vidal is using it to show the culture shock between the people of the young interviewer's generation and the people of the founding fathers' generation, like Aaron Burr. And you find out Aaron Burr tells all these stories about what life was like working for George Washington or dealing with Alexander Hamilton or so on. And you're also seeing Aaron Burr really close to the end of his life, full of energy, running around, constantly trying to get initiatives going. And he talks about how Aaron Burr tried to conquer Canada, which we don't talk about in our history. We leave that part out. We're like, no, we're a noble isolationist people who were always peaceful. It's like, no, the founding fathers were busy trying to take the entire continent if they thought they could get away with it. And then another one, Aaron Burr gets in trouble later because he also tries to conquer Mexico. It's like, right? And he gets a lot of people to support him. A lot of the founding fathers were like, okay, now that we're free of Britain, let's become an empire. Let's immediately take everything we can. None of that's arbitrary fiction. That's Gore Vidal, his best research about what Aaron Burr really thought he was up to in his life. So it's a fascinating portrait. The other really interesting thing to look at in this department, aside from the gradual conquest of the continent, the middle of the continent, is Mark Twain's diatribes against the U.S. government about our intervention in the Philippines. Because the U.S. wanted to be an empire overseas as well as domestically. So we went and conquered the Philippines. We fought a war with Spain, which ostensibly was for freedom, but what freedom meant was you don't work for the Spanish, you work for us. You're our people, not the Spanish's people. It was a lot of Americans were very angry about that. Like you say, there was an isolationist bent among many of the people in the population, not all of them. The isolationists were pretty angry about our adventures in the Philippines. So we've always had the impulse to empire. There's lots of evidence that, in our actions, it was always our intent. So, but we have a brand, and when we get to modernity, two and a half years from now, in this book, we'll be talking about how the U.S. replaces virtue with brands, and the brand has virtue, and you're supposed to say how much you believe in the brand, the more you believe in the brand in the modern world, the more you're able to do horrible things, as long as you do them quietly in ways that don't damage your brand. So we can have slaves as long as we say that we're about freedom, and we can be an empire as long as we say that we're isolationist. We can abuse human rights as long as we say that we're for them. There's all of these, the brand has to be protected at all costs. And that's what we have instead of virtue. The point you made earlier, I actually wanted to underscore something you said. And it just remembered it right now when talking about brands, the modern version of virtue. The Romans had virtu, which is where virtu, which is where we get the word virtue. And virtu comes from vir, which is a man. Virtu meant manliness. And manliness is good, of course. You don't want to, if you're a Roman, you're patriarchal, you don't want to be womanly. That's horrible. Who would want to be womanly? Then you're going to get conquered and defeated and raped, and you'll have to do domestic labor. You want to be a man. Men are good, right? This is the Roman position. And they made a list of characteristics that they thought made up manliness. So here's Cicero writing about virtue. And his version of writing about virtue, first of all, has the weird perversion that it's about might makes right. How do you be as strong as possible? How can you be the strongest? Be the best that you can be, all that you can be, right? The army slogan from the 1980s and 90s. This was the Roman concept of virtue. The reason to be honest and all these other things is because you'll win. That's how you win. And of course, that's winners win. You don't want to be a loser. Cicero wrote extensively about virtue, and he also was translating ancient Greek writings by Aristotle and others into Roman, and he was presented with a problem. And the problem is that the Greeks don't have a word that means virtue. They have this word arete. The moderns translate arete as excellence, but of course, that's not what it means. Arete to the Greeks has to do with sophrosune. Where does health lie for our species? Where does vitality lie for our species? What is the way that we are to live within the larger ecosystem of the world that we evolved to be able to do? Where are our distinctive excellences that allow us to pursue a way of life that's sustainable and healthy? So arete has to do with those kinds of strengths, the strengths that lead to health, not the strengths that lead to winning. That's weird too. But the strengths that lead to sustainable vitality for our species and ourselves. That's arete. The cheetah's speed is an arete, not because it wins, but because it allows the cheetah to live the aetia, the way of life of a cheetah, which weaves into the larger fabric of nature in such a way that if a cheetah lives that way, all cheetahs thrive, and the larger ecosystem thrives. They both thrive. They both do better because the whole can't exist without the part, and the part can't exist without the whole. They have to be woven together. All of this is in the concept of arete. None of it is in the concept of virtu. And certainly none of it is in the modern concept of brand. So when you look at sort of the moral collapse from the level of thinking about sophrosune and arete to collapsing down to thinking about virtu and winning and losing and manliness, and then you think about the moral collapse from that all the way down to it's just your brand that matters because that way you make more money if people think that you're honest. It's like, oh my God, the nihilism. How deep does it go? It's like the Romans sort of plumbed half the depths for us. Donna, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Okay, this is more relevant to about 10 minutes ago. But in any case, you're talking about arete, and I'm going to switch this from the literal world to art and architecture and give examples because that to me is in a language too. Let's go back first to Rome and the Pantheon versus the architecture you saw in the series Rome. Anybody who's been in the Pantheon and stood in it knows that is not a design for people. That is a design to be in awe of the gods and, etc. And at the same time, as an engineering feat, it's remarkable. It's withstood a number of wars, bombings, etc. Remarkable piece of engineering. I'm not sure that many of the structures in Rome that were presented there in that series lasted more than 100 years. Okay, going to the modern era, arete, compare Christopher Alexander's architecture, his conception of design, and somebody like Paolo Soleri and his city in the desert. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but my husband and I were there in the 70s, kind of shoveling cement and trying to help. And we quickly got disillusioned, but that is not a design for humans. It is a design out of the ego and an amazing creativity of one architect, Solari, but this is still going on. I think this design for the human, which is Christopher Alexander's work, and somebody like Solari, the Pantheon, and let's say the structure, most of the structures that have fallen down that were built for humans in the Roman Empire. It still goes on, that battle of egos that I don't know. I mean, there's something to be respected in the Pantheon and its engineering quality, even though it wasn't designed for humans. There's something to be respected in the renderings and the beauty of what Solari conceived of, but it's not really made for humans. It's, um, and I know this is another language, but I'm fairly familiar with this language repeating itself throughout history. And when you were talking about arete, yeah, that can be expressed, particularly in architecture and design for humans, and the designs that really aren't for humans, but are designed out of the individual ego that thinks it's for humans. So there are
my
many
language.
examples. I was thinking of that. It related much more to what was said 10 minutes ago than now, but I did the little segue.
So you always get a free pass for going back to earlier topics and bringing them up again.
But do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's the nature of the format that we use here. If we let people really explore these ideas and talk about them, it means that the line might get long and it might be a while since the topic that you wanted to talk about. So you always get a pass. It's always good to go back.
I don't mind that. I'm just comparing Christopher Alexander to
Yes.
certain other modern day, frou-frou
I'm
architects.
so excited that you did that comparison. I am also crazy for Christopher Alexander. I also grew up. I have the book Arcology downstairs, and the same critique, right? They're these big, beautiful, amazing things full of ideas, and yet if you actually try to live in them, they're inhuman. You didn't work at that level. You do the side by side comparison with like a pattern language where he talks about what are the details of making a livable house. How far from windows should you ever be? Should your building have windowless rooms in the basement where people work for 8 hours with no sunshine ever landing on their skin? And these are the sorts of human considerations. Once you see them, you feel the reality of the observations in them, the vitality of them, and then suddenly their absence in Paolo Solari's work becomes conspicuous. Whereas until you're exposed to the details and think about them, at first blush, the Paolo Solari stuff is just it's so strong it grabs you. Oh my God, a city that's a bridge over a canyon. Whoa, what an idea!
And the renderings are stunning.
It's beautiful drawings,
beautiful works of art. And the Pantheon is something you're in awe of it when you're standing in it. However, do you want to live there? And at the same time, as an engineering feat, it withstood many bombings, much history.
Yes.
Remarkable. But yeah, do you want to live there? No.
Yeah, not responsive to sustainable human health, right?
Yeah.
Not focused on. Yeah.
So I just moved into another language there, but
I love it
very strongly. So
I love it. Thank you, Donna. And yeah, we want to bring all of these different languages to bear on these problems. They give us ways to illustrate what we're trying to explore. So I really appreciate it. It's the issue of sophrosune and its presence or absence in a culture or its worldview is one that it's easy to go your whole life overlooking until you first really come to grips with it. And then when you do, you suddenly look back on your life and go, where has this been all my life? Why does nobody talk about this? Why? On the one hand, it's a self-answering question, and on the other, it's a question that should never be allowed to be omitted. How can it be that the Constitution of the United States, when listing the requirements to be president, doesn't include would this be good for the country? Does this person actually want to make the world a sustainable, healthy place? Or do they just want to bomb everything? It's like, how is this not, how can you look at educational standards, the testing standards, and how can they be about passing and failing and not being about what kind of people would we be creating by doing this? Now, how can it be so focused on human beings' utility as human resources for other people to wield, and so little on, is this healthy or good or sane for people to live this way? And you can see that part of the reason why these things are missing from the Constitution and the educational standards is, who's qualified to talk about what's good for the species when we live our whole lives just trying to, pay our bills? Because our entire worldview is focused on the practical necessity of not becoming homeless, if we're lucky enough to be able to avoid it. And it doesn't leave room for things like, is this good for anybody? Should fracking waste be dumped in aquifers? They're aquifers. What are we doing? Putting carcinogenic substances into our sources of drinking water. It's insane, right? It's unhealthy. But modern civilization doesn't have the concept of sophrosune. Laws are not accountable to whether they advance sophrosune. Educational standards are not. The economy is not. Nothing is designed to aim towards sophrosune. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You realize why this concept was so important to the Greeks and why we're utterly unable to translate it into English. So it's just an alien concept to us. What? The good of the world? The good of the species? I have no idea what you're talking about. This is gibberish, right? So part of what I love about Christopher Alexander is, I fell in love with Christopher Alexander's work in the early 90s, I guess. And I didn't have the concept of sophrosune in any detail. I had it roughly starting around the 2000s, but I didn't have it in detail until we started doing the seminar. And we did our deep dive on chapter 4 and really dug into these concepts. And once I had it, it changed the way I read Christopher Alexander. It's like, oh my God, he's talking about sophrosune. He's saying that architecture should serve human health and sanity, not personal ego, and not what's the cheapest price at which I can throw up a bunch of dwellings that nobody would want to live in. What is the effect that our built spaces have upon us and our health, and how do we take responsibility for that? And it's like, yeah. So yeah, bring that in anytime you want to, Donna. I'm on board with these topics. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Donald's going to talk. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
But Donna's a very wise woman.
I know, right?
I haven't said, I live in the Phoenix, Arizona area. I've been to Arco Santi. I've seen, and to sum up, as she did, the problem with, you go there and you're expecting a recreation of the cliff-dwelling Indians that lived in this area and their harmony with nature. And you see these monstrous concrete castings, She just summed it up so well. They're not for human beings. Of course, you can pay money to live in them if you want to study architecture, but I didn't want to. Well, thank you, Donna.
Just wanted to tell you, when we were there in the 70s, my husband and I were buying our own shovels and our own cement to serve this man's needs. And I got over that very, very quickly. I really did.
Well, some of these things, like they had some sense, like he had these quarter spheres, designed like the cliff dwellings, supposedly to catch the sun in the winter to provide shade in the summer and stuff.
Right.
Only the engineering was all off, and they had huge anchor bolts and steel cables to keep them from collapsing because they were structurally unsound.
Yeah.
And I just like, okay, what is this? This is
Yeah.
just a joke, you know? I think the only thing that was functional was the swimming pool at Solari's personal residence, which is not where you got to live if you decided to pay money to work there.
Right.
But he did beautiful renderings though. Beautiful
Oh.
renderings. Yeah, really good.
Architectural
Yeah.
drawings.
And I did buy a bell, a little wind chime bell that I hung on my patio.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, Donald, you seem to be objecting to the modern concept of the flying buttress. Steel cable going.
Well,
Just buttress that thing up there. It'll hold up.
I just,
Yeah.
well,
In
thank you,
in
Donna.
another life, I could have easily ended up doing what Donna did. And I actually told my friends I wanted to go to Arcosanti and contribute to realizing the vision from this book, because the book is so amazing and the drawings are so amazing. And I would have had exactly the same experience. It's like, it's so cool. It's so cool. It's, why don't I feel like this is cool anymore? Why do I not want to be here? Something isn't right. And I can't put my finger on what the hell it is. But yeah, well, eventually we get the language to express the things that we're feeling. In a way, the difference between the arcologies that we imagine when reading the book and the arcology in process that we stand in at Arcosanti it's the difference between gnosis and noesis. The ideas are amazing, the drawings are amazing, the system, the conceptions, the geometry, but then you actually get into it and you feel your gnosis feels what it's like to relate to it on the ground, and it tries to tell you, man, this noesis has some problems. There's some holes in these theories, and you can't see them from inside the theory. You can only see them when you feel them when you go there. So yeah, thank you for that. Joe, you had your hand up and then you put it down.
Yeah. No, it was it's just to build a little bit off of this. It's just, I think that ultimately, when you read this quote, and it says, not by virtue, but by brute force, Rome triumphed over autonomous Greek polis and their codes of communal values. And you think about even that, how architecture and things about that, how you treat nature, as something that be dominated versus actually something that you're working within. And it's an interesting perspective to take, because I think that sometimes, even though I do think the Romans were very good at reusing materials, and they were very efficient, and the aqueducts were quite an accomplishment, so that they definitely had ways of working with nature. I don't can't take that away. But this idea of brute force and just like kind of dominating nature and as seeing it as something to be overcome leads it to a less human-centric type of design. And you can kind of see that in the industrialized age quite a bit, right? Where you're starting to see how to impose on nature. And I think that that's it's representative of a lot of different things, where one of the things that we talked about a little bit earlier was the idea of values themselves, right? What are the values? What are the values of the society? And if you start to look at everything on a very just practical level, you start to look at it from dominating it. It's only like kind of, what do I need to get this done? As opposed to whether it's wise to do it in the first place. So that sometimes when you're only dealing in the practical and the concrete, in the particular, and not necessarily dealing with higher degrees of, I would say, abstraction, and to where you're asking the question of whether or not why we should do something, or why are we doing something, or should we do something, is perhaps a better way for it. And it does manifest itself in the material world.
Right.
This is the architecture that really kind of starts to emerge when you see the values of the culture itself.
Mhm.
So you see the social values, and you kind of see the designs and how even just material material goods and even the technology that's even emerges as well. So it is interesting to see this because we're looking at it from a political sense and the political system itself, but we're also seeing how this has a way of actually manifesting itself in the material world and some of the results of that. And again, not all bad, not all good, but at the same time, definitely not nuanced.
Yes.
So and in any case, so.
Yeah, I'm finishing up reading a novel by Ursula Le Guin, although you can't quite call it a novel. It's a book. It's called Always Coming Home, and it's one of her longest works, in which she's describing a post-apocalyptic culture. It's California, Northern California after the apocalypse, but it's not like Road Warrior. It's more like re-indigenizing. It's a people that have changed their value system to try to avoid doing the things that modern industrialized civilization did that led to the apocalypse. Bye, James. See you next week. And it's written like an ethnography because her dad, Kroeber was a famous anthropologist who wrote ethnographies on all kinds of California indigenous groups. And so she's writing this where it's like parts of it are like a story, and then other parts are like ethnography, and other parts are poetry or dance or song collections. And then it'll go back to the story for a while, and then it'll go back to the poetry. It even shipped with when I bought my copy when she first put it out. It even shipped with the cassette tapes. You could listen to the songs, and she's really trying to show what Northern California would be like for people to live in an indigenous way, as a successor to modern industrialized civilization. So again, it's thinking about these questions of gnosis and noesis, and what happens if you live, for soprasune rather than living for, achieving practical objectives. And it includes a spin-off culture that's militaristic and very patriarchal that exists at that time, that is attempting to recreate the glory that was the previous civilization while everybody else is just trying to live their lives. And the things you're talking about, are really dramatized.
Everything becomes an assembly line.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially including people themselves.
Right.
So then there's a role for men and women in that assembly line.
Yes.
And that's the role, so that there it becomes very mechanized.
Yes.
And this is really evident at the turn of the century.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you can look at the American family as an assembly line. Man did this, woman did that, kids did that. It's like, and that was the way we kind of operated. And you saw the rights of individuals then actually lost in that process. But anyway, I know we're over time, so I don't want to.
Yeah, we'll have to wrap up. But this was good, and so we'll finish paragraph 8 and get into paragraph 9 next time. But kind of a little bit of foreshadowing. Up until now, a lot of our focus has been on showing how the newly emerging medieval civilization and its worldview suffer by comparison with the ancient worldview and civilization. But he's about to take us into a section where we're going to look at ways in which it was an improvement. Things that simply had to be stopped in the old Roman way of life, that had to be replaced, and how medieval culture, offered an escape from those traps. It's very interesting stuff Kenneth's doing here. So I hope you all had a good time. I hope you have a great week.
Had a great time.
This is, as always, one of the highlights of my week. Thank you all.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, and
Yes,
thank
Happy
you for
New
the time.
Year.
Yeah.
Nice to
Healthy
see
New
you,
Year.
Aaron.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good to see you all.
Bye.
Everyone
Thanks,
soon.
Rick.
Hey, Rick,
Yeah.
if you and David ever get to the end and need a proofreader, for your
We will.
book.
We will. You're volunteering.
Yeah, I am.
Thank you.
It's unlike me, but to volunteer for anything, but
We will take you up on that.